It gives me immense pleasure to welcome all our esteemed speakers for today's webinar and our participants for the webinar today hosted by RTI and ISGF on electricity distribution, creating the change. The grid in the next decade will be very different than the present day's grids in most parts of the world. Clean energy from solar, wind, which could be stored cheaply and transported as well, will very much be a possibility. And a strong driving force for the change is the shift in the attitudes and the behavior among the consumers. Our consumers are becoming very demanding. And on the other hand, the consumers are becoming producers of energy as solar panels become less expensive and we see increased electrification in our society, such as the uptake of electric cars, electric vehicles also getting on the roads and getting injected to the grid in future. Increasingly, more of our consumption will require reliable electricity supply. Electricity use in India is projected to triple by 2040, driven by the economic growth, higher average income, and better income distribution. The rapidly increasing use of electric applications, including EVs, as I mentioned, population growth, and urbanization. Therefore, to become future ready and yet remain within the sustainable envelope of net zero carbon emissions targeted at the national level by 2050. Distribution utilities will need to control losses, enhance investments in smart metering, digitalization, and becoming more efficient and having a skilled set of employees to be able to adopt and take digitalization journey of the utilities forward. With that background, with this webinar, we wish to address some of the key issues with the expert discussion with our expert panelists here today. I am Reena Suri, Executive Director, India Smart Grid Forum. I am the host for today's webinar. I'll take just a few minutes to quickly introduce our moderators and panelists for today. And before that, a quick glance at today's agenda. We will have Mr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia addressing or making the opening remarks and setting the agenda. Dr. Gaurav Bhatiani will provide the structure and key issues that we'll be taking forward, and as well as moderating, Mr. Sanjeev and Gaurav, Dr. Bhatiani will be moderating today's panel discussion with our esteemed panelists, Mr. S Padmanabhan, Dr. Rajib Mishra, Mr. Reji Kumar, Mr. Prabir Neogi, Ms. Anjali Garg, Mr. Shalabh Srivastava, followed by some question answers by the moderators to the panelists, and we'll also be taking up some questions from the audiences. So you're most welcome to post your questions in the chat box, and our moderators will scan through and take up some key questions with our panelists. I'll quickly introduce our
some people complain right now. There is some people posted on the chat box that there is no audio. Please check. Nidhi, please check. Thank you.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can. We'll check. Definitely.
We can hear you clearly.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so quickly introduce our moderators and panelists. We have Mr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia. He's the advisor with Observer Research Foundation. Mr. Ahluwalia remains affiliated with the Energy Research Institute, where he worked for 3 years, and Kutch Center for Infrastructure Regulation and Competition in an honorary capacity. Warm welcome to you, Mr. Ahluwalia. We have Dr. Bhatiani is the Director Energy with RTI India. Dr. Bhatiani will be moderating will be co-moderator today with Mr. Ahluwalia. He's the Senior Energy and Infrastructure Expert with 24 years of experience in leadership, management, technical, and advisory positions across South Asia. Welcome, Dr. Bhatiani. We have Mr. Prabir Neogi as our first panelist. I'm introducing, he's the Chief Advisor, Corporate Affairs with CESC Kolkata, and currently advising RP Goenka Group, RP Sanjeev Goenka Group in matters related to corporate affairs and assisting group companies in policy and regulatory matters impacting individual businesses. And he brings over 40 years of experience with in utility industry and holds leadership positions involving business transformations in power and coal sector. Warm welcome to you, Mr. Neogi. Mr. S Padmanabhan, he's retired from as a senior energy advisor from USAID India. Mr. Padmanabhan has 35 years of experience and has worked as senior energy advisor with World Bank, USAID, and several agencies of Government of India. He's an enthusiast, advocate, writer, designer, planner, devoted to sustainable development and energy conservation. Warm welcome, Mr. Padmanabhan. We have next panelist, Mr. Rajib K Mishra. He's the director from PTC. Mr. Mishra, he heads the Business Development Marketing Department of PTC India Limited. He's the key personnel for business development activities related to power purchase and sale under open access. And he's also responsible for cross-border trade, power trading for Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. A warm welcome, Mr. Mishra. We have Mr. Shalabh Srivastava. He's the country director, RTI International India. Mr. Srivastava brings 2 decades of management consulting experience to his current role. He focuses on penetrating new markets in the Indian subcontinent in the sectors of power, renewables, clean hydrocarbon fuels, air quality, and smart cities. And I would like to also mention that he has been a co-author of 2016 update to Smart Grid Roadmap for India, which was published by India Smart Grid Forum. And he's also a board member of India Smart Grid Forum. Warm welcome to you, Mr. Shalabh. And next we have Mr. Reji Kumar Pillai. He's the president India Smart Grid Forum since the inception of the forum in 2011, and is also the chair of Global Smart Grid Federation, which is an umbrella body of similar organizations like ISGF in different countries since November 2016. He's an internationally renowned expert with over 3 decades of experience in the electricity sector in diverse functions covering the entire value chain and across continents. Warm welcome, Mr. Pillai, to the webinar. And we're glad to have a female panelist with us, Ms. Anjali Garg, energy specialist from IFC. She's bringing 19 years of experience across public and private sector. Her expertise lies in renewable energy, energy access, and regulatory policy issues in the energy sector and climate finance. A warm welcome, Ms. Garg. With that, I invite Mr. Sanjeev S Ahluwalia to present the opening remarks and for setting the agenda for today's webinar. Over to you, Mr. Ahluwalia.
Thank you, Reena. I hope I'm audible. Try to unmute myself. Is it okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So, good afternoon, everybody. And a special thanks to RTI and to the Indian Smart Grid Forum for inviting me to moderate this session along with Dr. Gaurav Bhatiani. And a warm welcome also to all the participants. I mean, Reggie and Reena were telling me that there's something like 1,500 people who signed up for this program. So I hope that, at least one half of them have actually bothered to clock in and listen to this wonderful panel that the 2 organizations have put together for you. It's a panel which actually demonstrates different skill sets and different experiences, but what is common is their commitment to excellence, their deep commitment to working in the energy sector, and to solving real problems on the ground. My job here is actually just to kind of like a filler between you and the panelists, so I will not take long at all. And my job really is to, give a little bit of perspective within which you should think of the power sector during this webinar. If you are reading about the power sector, I'm sure there are many specialists and engineers and economists and others who are in the participants. So this is known to them, but possibly there are others who are not that familiar but would like to learn. And so what I'm going to say is really for them, for the learners, not for the gurus who are sitting in the audience. I might remind you that you're not going to be sitting there only. You're also going to be participating in a short while, because the way India Smart Grid Forum organizes these things is very interactive and very participative. So, if you think, let's adopt a balance sheet approach to looking at the power sector in India today. And by that, I mean starting by looking at, the assets and the liabilities. Now, on the asset side, let's first start with generation. Now, generation, is a unqualifiedly great story. Generation capacity over the last 26 odd years, has grown by something like 5.5 times. And if that doesn't impress you, then, the fact that we are or have been surplus in power for the last 2 years or so should speak to the fact that India has overcome the traditional problem that was that, supply never could meet demand. Well, today, supply can meet demand, even though demand may be muted for various reasons, but there is enough supply today to meet demand. And that's an important thing to happen, because it's only when you have sufficient supply that you can go towards the objective that the 1991 reforms looked at, which is market orientation. You can't have a market orientation when you have huge demand shortages. The first prerequisite of a market is to have a surplus so that people can sell it, sellers can compete to sell what they have, and buyers can compete to buy what sellers have. That has actually happened in generation. The second important, development in generation is that, there's a spatial shift in generation assets. When we started way back 30 years ago or even earlier, most of the generation used to happen in the east, some in sort of east central part, and then in the south. But since then, and with the gas and renewable energy becoming respectively 10 and 22% of our power capacity portfolio, the spatial distribution of generation assets has shifted in favor of the West, where a lot of the gas is imported, and the South, where, because the economy has grown very fast, the need for power has grown very fast, and therefore there has been an incentive, to set up imported coal plants, gas plants, and also put up plants which are still importing coal from eastern and central India. Ownership has also undergone an enormous change. When we started 1991, most of the assets were publicly owned. There was very minuscule private ownership of power, and Mr. Neogi is one of the exemplary examples, of a company that was privately owned and was working well along with Tata Power at that time, and BSES, of course, but very minuscule. Today, 44 or 45% of generation assets are held by the private sector. And the incremental addition of generation has been more in the private sector over the last 7 years than in the public sector. So that's an enormous change from the time, in the late 90s, when Enron became the kind of standard bearer of private participation in generation. And there was so much fuss being made about, a single plant coming up. Today, we have 150 gigawatts of private power, something like that. and it's taken for granted. And that's good, because that means that India has grown. Now, the other great change that has happened is in the structure. In the structure of these generators, they aren't departments of government anymore as they used to be. They are not just publicly owned corporations as they used to be. Today, many of these generators, actually I would say most of them, are definitely public limited corporations, and many of them are also listed on the stock exchange. So you have a daily barometer, of their success or their failures in the market value of their stock, which is an enormous change from what was there earlier. And all this, therefore, is a sign of the maturity of the generation sector. Now, the sad part is, and this is where the liabilities part of the balance sheet kicks in, that, while all the attention was being focused on generation over all those many years, the other part of the electric power sector, which is the distribution sector, was in a way, I would say, neglected or not given as much importance, because we were unpeeling the onion layer by layer. And the first layer was to become surplus in generation. The next layer was to have strong, robust transmission. And that happened towards the late, after around 2010 to 2013, because transmission capacity has grown 7 times over 12 years, right? And in that, I don't know, practitioners would remember that there used to be a choke point where power could not be sent from the west or the east to the south. Because demand was huge in the south, but plants were all outside the south, and you couldn't, transmit power into the south. There was a choke point over there. And that choke point got opened up by a 3 times growth in the capacity to transfer power from the east and the west over a period of 7 years, last 7 years, into the south. So there was a strategic investment in the transmission sector, which also made Indian transmission of near international quality. Now, that we had a big blowout, a blackout, about 3 or 4 years ago. These things do happen. But on a daily basis, if you look at the way the frequency is, the grid frequency, it's pretty good. And I take pride in saying that, because, I was in the CERC when the first availability-based tariff, the first little baby step was taken to ensure that there were market incentives for getting the grid frequency right. And today, there are so many complex arrangements which ensure that the grid frequency remains stable, so you don't have blackouts and brownouts. So transmission has also matured. Going on to distribution. On the asset side, it's a good story. If you look at the agricultural pumps that they energize, they've grown by twice as much as they were in 2010. So in the last 9 years, you've added on double the number of pumps. In terms of households, it is today, a household fact. The Prime Minister's program has energized about 26 million households, which did not have electricity earlier, over the last 3 to 4 years. And it's kind of a huge achievement internationally. And today, not only in the old days, we used to talk about villages. That scenario got over by about 2016, 17. All the villages were electrified. Now all the households are electrified. So that part of access is assured to distribution. The sad part is that the distribution business is not in good health. And it makes losses which average anything around 30 to 70,000 crores a year, which is a massive amount, which pulls down the strength and the capacity of distribution entities to invest in their systems and give better services to their customers. So that is the biggest liability that we have on the balance sheet. But if you look at the CEA's report 2018, in fact, even I was surprised to see this, that, there are 8 states which supply 24/7 power, including Gujarat, to their customers. There are another 6 states that supply between 23 to 24 hours of power a day to their customers, and another 3 that supply 20 to 23 hours. And there are just 10 states. And oddly enough, this includes Haryana and Karnataka, Mr. Padmanabhan will be interested to see whether this statistic is right or not. Your state, sir, just gives power for less than 20 hours a day. Now, I don't know, less than is a strange number because could also be 2 hours a day and 20 hours a day. So there's a big range. But, I mean, imagine my generation grew up, with lantern and candles and things like that. Today, you have 18 out of 28 states where you get more than 23 hours of supply a day. That's a massive change. That's a huge change in the quality of supply. So, so what is wrong with distribution? Now, one is clearly this tariff is wrong. See, the idea of the 1991-92 reforms was to delicense, to take away administrative controls so that markets could operate and that goods could be supplied and distributed cheaply. We have an administered tariff today, and as a result of that, it's distorted. And because of that, I think you don't get the kind of revenues that you could if tariff was allowed to be freer than it is today. Now, there is a case there for lifeline supplier, particularly in electricity as in water, but the financial burden of that should very clearly come from the state governments, not from the distribution utilities. I think this statement will resonate with Mr. Neogi, who was an old distribution hand. But there's a lot of truth in it. If your distribution sector is not strong, your power sector is weak. It is weak. It will not grow. It will not sustain itself. It will not supply quality power. There are some good things. Do I have time? Another 1 minute? I haven't spoken too much. So I'll just make 2 short points now. There are other good things that are happening, which we're going to be discussing during when we talk to the panelists also. And one is, that finally, there is a market operating in India. 9% of power is traded outside the long-term PPAs. Dr. Rajib Mishra is going to be the founder of one of the latest new exchanges that PTC will set up in competition to the existing exchange. And both of these will be private sector. I don't know if you call your PTC private sector, but I mean, from the books, it looks like a private sector. So, both of these will be more or less private sector exchanges. And that's a very, very, very big change for India. Lastly, on regulation, I was a staff member of the CERC. So obviously I'm a fan of the CERC, so I'm a bit biased. I have to admit that. But I think they've done a great job. More recently, they had this very far-reaching 2018 regulation that they issued, which was to allow the transmission of power through India to third countries, which actually feeds directly into building a regional power market. And that is where we should be hitting. Mr. Padmanabhan, who's a veteran of USAID, they've been trying to build a regional power market since the 2000s, and we've moved very, very slowly. But hopefully, with this regulation being in place, I think that dream will now become a reality. There are other good things they've done. They've tried to introduce a mechanism for enforcing contracts, because contract enforcement has also led to some financial difficulties for suppliers, basically on the provider side. And the best thing that they are doing is to emphasize that, and the government is emphasizing now, that subsidy has to be borne by the state governments, not by the utilities, and that state regulators are now probably maybe appointed, if the amendment goes through a committee which includes people from the central government, so that there is more similarity in views and in the way regulators are recruited and allowed to run these regulatory commissions in the state governments. So bottom line, I feel Indian power market is matured, and the only thing is to realize the full potential of this market. We need 4 things. We need to further enhance markets. Dr. Mishra is doing exactly that. We need to make governments accountable for subsidy. not only the central government, but even the regulators are trying to do that. We need to incentivize energy efficiency. Please remember that, while generation capacity grew by 5.5 times only, the economy has grown by 9 times in that same period, those same 26 years. So India has decoupled itself from additional energy capacity and additional energy generation and therefore use, which is a very big step towards meeting the climate change objectives to which we're committed by 2035. One thing that we must do, however, is not to have a one-size-fits-all type of approach, cookie-cutter approach. It's a big country, there are 30 states. Each state should be allowed to develop its own model, its own structure of the power sector, which fits their own requirements. And it should fit into a national framework which has minimum standards embedded in it. That's all I wanted to say. I will now pass it over to Dr. Bhatiani with a word of apology, I think, for having taken longer than I thought I would.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I extend a very warm welcome to all our panelists and our participants. We appreciate your taking time to be with us this afternoon and share your perspective and knowledge. Thanks to Mr. Ahluwalia for opening remarks, brilliantly setting the agenda in a second manner. Thank you. To begin with, I want to quickly quote Theodore Roosevelt, who once said, "Power always brings with it responsibility." So while he was talking about the political power, I think that applies equally to the electricity. That is, it needs to be generated, transmitted, distributed, and used, in a responsible manner. And as we have seen dramatic transformation, in the generation, transmission, regulation, there is, things a lot better. But it can be reasonably argued that, on the distribution and use of electricity, that has perhaps not been the case. And therefore, we are today here to discuss what are the options for creating this change. And equally important, I think, how do we create a demand for this change? This is so because we have known for a while that a change is required, but nevertheless progress has been limited. Therefore, creating a demand for change, I think, is an equally important goal in itself, because in democratic societies and, as Sanjeev said, market-based economies, citizens and we as consumers need to play an important role. That is, how are we responsible for creating this demand for change? We have a very eminent panel, and what I'm going to do is quickly list 7 areas and a few questions around those, and then I will invite our panelists to start with their opening remarks for about 5 minutes each. So let me begin by saying, yes, number one area which Mr. Ahluwalia also mentioned about is financing and tariffs. We have seen some progress in reducing the losses. There have been several schemes, going back to APDRP, UDAY, and so on and so forth. But the financial losses of the distribution companies have continued to increase. Therefore, it's a legitimate question to ask, if the technical and commercial losses are reduced, where are the gaps? And to what extent those gaps are due to tariffs, subsidies, and so on. So I think that's one area which we would like our panel to touch upon. Another related aspect is, at this juncture, what is the ability of distribution companies to pay their immediate liabilities, particularly with demand significantly coming down. And yesterday we had a discussion, a decision at the CCEA to enhance the liquidity package, which I think is a positive step. But we also need to think about more, medium-term strategy, because this issue is not going to solve itself, with 370 gigawatts of capacity in the system and only around 185 or 190 gigawatts of demand. The second question, therefore, then, area is the planning and strategy. What is the medium-term strategy to resolve this issue where, utilities have too many PPAs, it seems, and while a market has been created, the volumes still are about 10%, 90% of the volumes continue to be in the long-term PPA. Related aspect, is how and what are the areas for investment which distribution companies should prioritize, given that they have only very limited capital allocate to invest in technologies, operations, etc. So what should be those areas which should be prioritized? Should technology be one of them? Because often it has been touted as a panacea, but can technology deliver on its own, without corresponding policy, regulatory, and institutional changes, is an area to think about. While we, always talk about investments, often the operations and maintenance in distribution business gets neglected, and that's where the front line is, or that's where the rubber meets the road. So operation and maintenance, so that the existing assets are maintained and we are able to take juice out of them, deliver high quality service. And lastly, is the area of ownership and restructuring. There has been talk about privatizing union territories. The central government has a plan at least to start with union territories. I think that can create a positive momentum. It can create best practices and good examples which states can look at. But is distribution privatization the end, or is it a means to an end? So I will at this point, stop here and invite our panelists to make opening remarks. They can pick up 1, 2, 3 multiple areas. I will request each of them to limit to 7 minutes. At the beginning, I will invite Mr. Padmanabhan. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gaurav. Good afternoon to all of you. Special thanks to Reena Suri and Sanjeev Ahluwalia and Gaurav Bhatiani for the kind words and your initiatives, specifically RTIs and ISGFs, to organizing this important webinar on electricity distribution, creating the change. 3 broad steps that can create this change. One is mandating integrated resource planning. The second is institutionalizing load research. And the third is considering energy productivity as a performance indicator in the farm sector. I'll spend the next 5 to 7 minutes in talking a little bit about these 3 broad steps. Much water has flowed under the bridge since power sector reforms took place in the early to mid 90s, and Dr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia described these rather well. There has been significant changes taken place in distribution, in generation, and so on. But yet, one of the unresolved issues of the Indian power sector reforms is distribution reforms. As I said, several measures have been taken. They've been more tactical than strategic, and the results have been rather uneven, notwithstanding the point that Dr. Ahluwalia rightly mentioned about power supply to villages having improved, many more pump sets having been brought online, many more households have receiving power, and so on and so forth. But one were to look at the progress on district fixes instead of a comprehensive overhaul. I think we need to move from tactical responses to strategic planning. And strategic planning requires a symmetrical approach to power planning rather than a sequential incremental approach. So what this really means, very simply said, is that we need to evaluate the cost benefit of each of the segments of the power system, generation, transmission, distribution, and end use, and introduce the IRP methodology or the integrated resource planning methodology. We need to mandate IRP through regulations so that when a utility proposes, for instance, a power plant, we begin to compare the marginal cost of generation with the marginal cost of transmission and distribution, and compare these with the cost of saved capacity and the cost of saved energy at the end use point, and then decide as to where we would put in our resources. So the first point I would like, without belaboring this any further, is that we need to enshrine IRP in LCD Act as a principle and a covenant. The next point is that there have been several studies which some of us were involved in, both in India as well as in other parts of the world, which basically show that it is cheaper, almost to the extent of 1/5 to 1/10, to save a unit of energy than to generate an equivalent amount. And this can be accomplished through integrated demand-side management, which is a combination of end-use efficiency and demand response. But demand-side management is all about data collection, analysis, and execution. And this is where I think we need to do a lot better. The load research function in most of our DISCOMs have been neglected, which is a real pity because we do collect a lot of information compared to what it was, for instance, in the 90s. I recall when I began some of my DSM work, very little information, if at all, was available. But today, with metering and so on at all parts of the network, there's a whole lot of information available, and yet the load research function has been neglected. The quantum and patterns of end-use loads can be tracked and profiled in a load research program. And a lot of questions which need to be answered can be addressed, like how much of peak load demand reduction is possible, how much of load shifting is possible, how deep can we go in terms of load management, and so on. And how does the proposed DSM program compare with alternate supply side generation, the point I had made earlier? So I would suggest that we should make it mandatory through regulations for DISCOMs to establish load research cells. And there are several other advantages of load research, tariff setting, network planning, network engineering, and so on. The flow of end-use data must be turned inward to inform ways to manage loads through TOD tariffs, design and application of efficient technologies. And DISCOMs can be a game changer as far as DSM is concerned. And I'm responding to the point that Sanjeev made about the need for energy efficiency. And DISCOMs can be a game changer in addressing and advancing energy efficiency. It can be the largest procurer and aggregator of efficient technologies and systems in partnership with vendors and ESCOs. A beginning has been made by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency in authorizing DISCOMs as designated consumers. The question to ask is whether, within the ambit of their responsibilities as designated consumers, can DISCOMs assume the role of megawatt generators, which implies the reverse of generating megawatts through integrated DSM programs. Now, with this key question, let me come to my third point, and I'll be brief, and then maybe get a chance to expand upon it at the next round of questions. And this point is possibly the most important, and this was something that Gaurav, you highlighted as one of the points you would like us to touch upon, and that is power supply to agriculture, the issue of subsidized pricing. I think we need to view the power supply to the farm sector a lot differently. We need to use agricultural energy productivity as the performance indicator for benchmarking and setting tariffs. What this means is that we need to implement schemes that promote increase in revenues from farm produce to enable farmers to pay cost of supply to the DISCOM and not subsidized tariffs. In short, we need to think of ways for farmers to increase their revenue per unit of energy consumed. Fundamentally, it means we need to ask the question, what is the energy used for by the farmers, and can it be used to generate greater value addition and hence greater profits to the farmers? For instance, the Kusum program or scheme of solarization of agricultural pump sets and setting up of decentralized solar power as an example. There can be several other examples aimed at improving energy productivity through diversification and modernization of agricultural practices, and not simply just energy efficiency to enable farmers earn more. And farmers, once they improve productivity of energy use, in other words, increase the value addition through diversification, then they would be in a position to pay for the power and they don't need to get subsidized power anymore. I shall be happy to elaborate further on this because I think this is a very, very important point, and I have not heard this in many discussions on power sector reforms where we could move away from our traditional approach of providing subsidy because that has not addressed the issue. The quality, reliability of power to farms may have improved, but the financial position of DISCOMs to deliver the power has definitely not improved. The cost of supply has been several magnitudes greater than the revenue that they get from the farm sector. The way to deal with it is not to continue with the subsidy program, not to continue the cross subsidization which takes place, but to look at a very different way of approaching this entire issue of power supply tariffs. And I would rest my case here and like to elaborate on this at the next round. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. That was very well thought out, structured kind of a look into the need for IRP and efficiency enhancement. I think Gaurav Bhatiani is a very wily man. He set up this meeting in a very wily way because we are moving from a participant who advocates bringing back planning, very micro level planning into the Electricity Act, to an advocate of the private sector who wants all regulations except the least, the most minimum regulations to be abolished. That's Dr. Rajib Mishra. So Dr. Mishra, your comments.
Thank you, sir. It is really a pleasure addressing to a gathering where we have seen people from all corners, right from regulators, from USAID, all the Mr. Reji from Smart Grid, Shalabh from the consulting side. So very interesting kind of a panel. And you have set a tone where we need to understand the entire gamut of the sector, but more specific, the today's agenda, that is the distribution. Although I represent market, but I would limit today the pain points of the distribution as such, and then the related areas in the market. For that, I have made a very small presentation. I would like to get that. Maybe it will not take more than 5 to 6 minutes, and then I'll explain what I have in my mind when I'm trying to present this case. Full screen, please. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. Sanjeev, you have very rightly said that India is made up of 30 states, more than 80 distribution companies. And whenever we are discussing, we discuss about the issues of DISCOMs. So if we are discussing issues of the DISCOMs, either they need to be one and the same, and one solution for all the DISCOMs. You rightly said, CA has presented a case where more than 15 states are doing wonders. There are 10 states which are contributing 80% of the losses. Whatever is receivable in the Ministry of Power portal, you will find only 5 states are contributing 80% of the receivables. AT&C losses for some states are at the range of around 40%. Some of these states, it is 8 to 9%. So that means we can't discuss all these states or the DISCOMs in one way. And that's what I am trying to see. from this small analysis which I have made, where it was before Uday, what happened after Uday, and there are a lot of new initiatives which Government of India is now taking to make this sector viable. So something very interesting which has come out is the accumulated loss has grew by 90% since 1890. 5 states are contributing almost 80% of the receivables, and we have done analysis of the top 10 states which is contributing the biggest losses, for which we are saying the weakest link in the energy value chain is the distribution side. Next slide, please. If I see the performance after Uday, it's very interesting, which we can see. AD&C losses have come down since 2016 to 2019. This is a very important thing which has happened, and it is hovering around 18-19%. The APPC, that is average power procurement cost, has come down. 2 contributions. One is, as Sanjeev has mentioned, there was surplus power, and the second is the renewable has come into fore in recent times. So the average power procurement cost has gone down. The billing efficiency have gone up. It has reached to a level of 84%. ACS-ARR gap, which came down till 2018, has again taken up. That means the gap between the average cost of supply and average cost of recovery is going up. That means there is a gap which needs to be filled. And the APPC per kilowatt hour is more or less flat. Next slide. Now, I mentioned that there are 5 or 6 states which are contributing the most, and 19 states in the country are having AT&C losses more than 15%. 26 states are having positive ACS-ARR gap, which was targeted to bring down to 0. 18 states are contributing, having more than 100 crores outstanding, with Rajasthan individually contributing around, which is the highest, 22,000 crores of outstanding. So that means the financial health of these states, if we just see the numbers, J&K is contributing the highest AT&C losses. Similarly, Rajasthan is contributing the highest gap, that is ACS-ARR gap. Similarly, the other parameters also are very reflective. But if I see from these numbers, we can say that 5 or 6 states are those states which we need to address very differently. I'll give you some glimpse of each state, how they are performing. Next slide, please. So we have analyzed different state reports, including PFC reports and the other Uday scheme reports from different corners. 5 states which are worth mentioning is Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Jharkhand, Karnataka, Telangana, and Bihar. They contribute significantly, and some of the states are doing better than those states. So if the problem is in those states, what are the solutions which we think we can address to? Next slide, please. We have taken the first case of Uttar Pradesh, where the outstanding is more than 13,000 crores. AT&C losses is very high. In some of the distribution areas, it is less, but in eastern part of the discoms, it is much higher. The average power procurement cost for different states are very different. In Uttar Pradesh, it is 3.73. Then we can say that the way they are procuring power from the market, at the first instance, if I see the merit order and other ways, it is not so efficient on the face of it. If I just try to analyze it in terms of parameters, target achievement after Uday, feeder metering was in rural and urban was done fine. Feeder segregation and smart metering was not done up to mark. DT metering urban was up to mark. DT metering retail rural was not done. AT&C losses, which is the most important thing in Uttar Pradesh, is something which is worrisome for them. ACS, that is cost of supply and revenue realization gap, is highest in Uttar Pradesh. So these out of the 8 parameters, in that 5 parameters they have not done up to mark, and those are the concern area for Uttar Pradesh. But let me tell you once again, I am trying to repeat that if I go state by state, the concern or the pain points are different for each state. Now Uttar Pradesh, we know AT&C losses is a pain point, whereas if I go to Tamil Nadu or Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, the concern is totally different. AT&C losses in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu may be very less, within the limits. Things are different, but the tariff rationalization is a problem. They have not revised the tariff for last so many years. The market or the renewable capacity what they have added in the last couple of years is giving unbalanced kind of a portfolio for them to handle. So if I go state by state, I'll not go all the 10 states, but I'm trying to give you a glimpse of the things, how the problem or the concern is different for each state. If I go to the next slide, please. Rajasthan, I told, out of the 8 parameters, only the feeder metering and urban and rural, they have done up to mark. Rest of all the parameters, they need to address those issues, because the AT&C losses is around 38%. No, they have added 38% renewable in their capacity. The outstanding payment is 22,000 plus. High APPC cost, which is more than 4 rupees 70 paisa. You will find some of the states procuring power at the rate of 2 rupees 80 paisa APPC. And Rajasthan, I'm not suggesting that it is an immediate issue which they need to address, but to make a distribution company viable, you need to have all these parameters to be addressed so that it should be made viable. I'll skip all the other states except for one of the southern states. Please go ahead. Next. Yeah. Andhra Pradesh, if I try to see, the APPC rate seems to be on a higher side, 3.87. ACS ARR cap is around 75 paisa. So that means they need a tariff rationalization at this point of time, and those are the concern areas which they need to address. Rather than if I compare it with the northern states, the issues are different. The AT&C losses are very high, but here the tariff rationalization seems to be the main problem. Next, please. Next. 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 Bihar is a unique case. Again, the AT&C losses is 34.32%, and the thermal power, they are dependent up to extent of 92%. APPC rate seems to be much higher, 4 to 12 paisa. Receivable in those states are very high, 110 days. So the problem for Bihar may be very different from problem of Tamil Nadu, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So we need to address those problems in a state specific way. Next, please. Jharkhand, again, the similar kind of problem. Now, in a very simple way, at this point of time, when I have a limited time, I would like to see it in 4 very focused approach, that if you need to make it the way we have done it in generation and transmission, Sanjeev was very right in saying that the transmission is world class today in the country, because we could address the issues which were there. Similarly, in generation, we could inject investment and we have larger participation of private. So the first proposition for distribution reforms can be carriage and content separation, although it has not come in the Electricity Act amendment, which is under consideration. They have tried to bring some changes like sub-licensee and distribution licensees, but in the way we all wanted from the industry, that the carriage and content should be separated, their wire business should be a separate business, and the supply electron business should be separate, has not come. Similarly, the tariff rationalization for some of the states, which has not gone for their revision for the last so many years, need to be done as early as possible. Then franchisee and distribution smart cities, like 100 cities have been identified as smart cities. Why can't we have a distribution franchisee for them, or a sub-licensee, which can make them more efficient and a better way of handling things than what we are doing today? And of course, meter infrastructure and upgradation, of course, is high on the agenda for the government and for all the distribution companies. Next slide, please. So Act 2003 amendment is trying to address some of the issues, but we still feel that the market need much more. 9% participation from the market, rest all tied up on long-term PPA is not the solution. You need to enable the distribution companies so that then they can procure best, because 80% plus of their cost comes from the power procurement. So the enabling them to buy it best from the market, from the best source, will be one solution. Of course, the wire business can be upgraded only if it can be separated from distribution. So if it is a loss-making distribution company, nobody is interested to inject money in the wire business also. So that's one area that need to be separated, and many other issues which we can address as and when it comes. And Gaurav will give me opportunity to ask specific questions on these issues, which I can address. But at this point of time, I can say that one size fit for all is not the solution. Then many more things, if we want the weakest link to come back to supplement the private generation and transmission and market, need to be done. And this is one area which needs attention of every policymaker and the regulator the highest. And I understand they are giving sufficient focus on this. With this, I'm trying to close. Thank you very much, Gaurav. Thank you, Sanjeev, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Rajib. I think an excellent presentation with a lot of detail. Very interesting, and I don't know how correct this is, but a preliminary conclusion which occurred to me as I was hearing you is there seems to be an inverse correlation in the sense that, states which have managed to reduce losses seem to be lagging, on tariff rationalization, and the other way around. So maybe, in the next round, maybe a comment on that I'd like to hear from you. But next we have Miss Anjali Garg, someone who's looking at financing, both from equity and debt perspective. And, it'll be very useful to hear, Anjali, from you, how IFC, for example, is thinking, about financing distribution, particularly as we move towards, maybe more private sector participation, because IFC is looking to support private sector. And what do you think also about the expansion of access, which is a broader development agenda for the World Bank Group? Anjali.
Hi, Gaurav, can you hear me?
Yes, Anjali, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been having some Wi-Fi issues, so I just wanted to check. Thank you so much for inviting me. Big thanks to RTI and the India Smart Grid Forum. And special thanks to Reena for ensuring that everyone knows that there is a female on the panel, which could otherwise would have been easily manal, as I call them. So thank you so much for getting that gender balance, at least some gender balance. That's great. So thanks a lot for that. So let me first begin by talking about a little bit about IFC and what we have done globally, because I assume a number of participants may actually not know why we are on this panel. So the International Finance Corporation is a member of the World Bank Group, and we are the largest development institution that works with the private sector. And supporting the power sector among infrastructure is actually the heart of our strategy for development globally. We work across the power sector, which is generation, transmission, and distribution, mostly in developing countries, and our focus is renewable energy within that. And the objective is that you're trying to remove barriers to private sector investment, and which is why this whole conversation and all the issues that you're talking about become very important, because ultimately from a private sector financing perspective, all of these are critical. So from the technology piece, to the losses, to increasing access, to innovation in business model, all of them come together for any distribution company to be able to attract private sector financing. So I think this whole conversation is very, very apt, very, very meaningful. From an IFC perspective, distribution is a very important area among the whole power sector. Globally, we have actually invested in more than 30 investments in distribution, and we've reached more than 106 million customers. So that's quite a number. And we've worked across many countries, including Brazil, Turkey, there's Uganda, Bolivia, Russia, and many others. I just want to briefly talk about, how does IFC get involved in the whole sector, and then come to India and the access piece and question, Gaurav, that you asked. So just an example, of how IFC, along with the World Bank Group, comes and helps the power sector, especially distribution, get transformed and private sector financing to flow in. You can hear.
Anjali, it seems there is some challenge at your end. Maybe you can switch off the video and be on the.
Can you hear me now, Gaurav?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay,
Go ahead.
great. I'll switch off the video. Sorry for this. I think the rains have been really hit the Wi-Fi hard. So I was talking about what we have done in Uganda and how the entire World Bank group comes together to facilitate private sector financing and mobilize resources, not just in distribution, but overall. But I'll give you the example particularly for distribution. So there is a distribution company in Uganda where we actually started investing about a decade ago. And we have been a long-term investor in that distribution company. And we've really worked with that distribution company on both the investment side as well as the advisory side, because the whole objective is to make them go through the process and get them to transform completely, where they're able to connect more consumers, they're able to improve their efficiency, they're able to reduce losses. So we are a long-term partner in this. We are not somebody who just invests and go out. We bring in a lot of other expertise. And in that journey of 10 years, Women now has, a customer base of 1.3 million customers, which is huge for Uganda. And, we brought together multiple arms of the World Bank Group to make this happen. So this was just to tell you how, we work and what is our interest as a private sector investor in this sector. Now coming to India, as all of you and Sanjeev also mentioned in his remarks, and other people also have been mentioning, the enormous financial pressure that is there on our distribution companies and the significant operational and financial efficiency. I mean, this is something which everybody knows. And for any private sector financing to come in, it is very important for, for them to have a line of sight on how this is all going to change. And, the recent conversation that we are having on the franchisees and the licensees and the innovation in business model, I think all of this could be game changers to unlock private sector financing in India. And actually, we are really interested and looking at this sector very, very closely. But I think what is important is that the distribution companies also need to be more inward looking. They need to look at their business models. They need to really look at, their operations can change and how multiple things come together, whether it is, franchisees, or whether it is rural energy provision, or whether it is billing and collection changes, energy efficiency, all of that and the impact that it would have on their balance. Then only private sector financing could come in when, on that path of corporatization and privatization. So that's what I wanted to talk about, from how does IFC look at this sector and what will it need to happen in the sector and in distribution companies for that.
Anjali, are you finished?
Hey, Gaurav, can you hear me?
Yes, we missed the last few sentences.
I'm really sorry for this. So I just wanted to quickly talk about the access piece, because Sanjeev spoke about it, Mr. Padmanabhan spoke about it, and you spoke about it, and I think all of this comes together. The hub scheme and the 100% electrification, the energy efficiency piece and discom losses. So I think it's important for us to, if you put all of this together and
Anjali, we are missing you. So maybe, we take this point in the second round, if that is okay.
phone. go, and I'll respond to this in the second round.
I think let's move on to the next panelist and we'll take Anjali's point in the second round, sir.
All right. So, normally it is said that the electricity sector lags telecommunications, right? In terms of delivery, service delivery and efficiency of services. But I think what is happening today is a clear example that actually a time has come in India where the reverse is true, that there are electrical services, but telecom is breaking down. So let us move on that note to a doyen of the electricity sector, Mr. Prabir Neogi, who has devoted his entire life to serving consumers, in the way they should be consumed, and through a private sector company, one of the earliest private sector distribution companies. Sir, your views on what all these young people are all saying. Does it make any sense from the perspective of a long-time practitioner?
And thank you, Sanjeev, for the introduction. It's a bit generous, no doubt. Yes, there's a much to learn, from we get to know nowadays from the younger generation, because the platform is changing, technology is turning around. So the any business, what it used to be a couple of decades back is entirely on a different footing. But firstly, let me also thank ISGF and RTI, for arranging the discussions and giving me the opportunity. And between the moderators, Sanjeev and Gaurav, we have already laid out the turf. So let me try and address the issues which Gaurav has raised, and also take on from where the earlier panelists had left. Firstly, in terms of distribution reforms, let's try to understand that it's a process, and it's also part of the decision making under a political economy. Having said that, you would recall that almost all the states without exception had not been in favor of the amendments proposed under the Electricity Act. And one of the issues they have raised is centralization of powers. So that becomes an issue. So unless and until we have legislative support for what we want to do, it's not going to happen. Because eventually, when distribution is under state ownership, the execution on the ground becomes more of a principal-agent relationship with very little accountability. Now, is that going to change under private ownership? Yes, provided there is competition. But I'll rest my argument there, but I'll rather move on to changing the narrative a bit. First of all, what have we achieved? Sanjeev, you rightly drew up the balance sheet, and Dr. Rajib Mishra also charted out, the progress or the lack of progress we have been making in distribution sector, and he has been able to, point the anomalies amongst the states, some good, some bad. Firstly, see, what have we achieved? If you leave aside the balance sheet issues, our per capita consumption is one of the lowest. We are not meeting the SDG 7 goals. So eventually, what purpose the industry is serving? We also have the paradox of power surplus with unreliable power supply. We also have the paradox of high electricity prices hurting exports. So which segment of the consumer are we really serving? Is it the industry? Is it commerce? Is it agriculture? Mr. Padmanabhan spoke about free electricity or subsidized electricity to agriculture. But finally, which end are we serving? Again, I'll rest my argument there and I'll move on to what COVID-19 has really taught us. We have seen that our business model under distribution is extremely fragile. if not inflexible, because we are overly dependent on cross-subsidizing consumer supporting the bulk of the revenue. That's one. So is it the right way we are taking up the cross-subsidy part? In my mind, it is not. And I'll come to that. Two is, it also shows our business model is not resilient to demand shocks. Okay, it's accentuated by COVID, but it's going to come. And if you don't see the writing on the wall, we are not going to survive under the existing distribution structure. Meaning thereby, and this issue has been touched upon already, that distribution companies sooner or later are going to declining load growth because of the onset of energy efficiency as a resource, because of the increasing influence of demand side management and demand response systems, because of the increasing ingress of distributed energy resources, electric vehicles included. So that's the landscape. Now, is my business model sufficient and flexible enough to face the future shock? To my mind, no, and that is what COVID-19 has laid bare. So it's a wake-up call. Now, I'll change track a little bit and see where do distribution lies in the context of economic reforms. Now, you rightly said, Sanjeev, that we have made so much of progress in generation transmission, but the bottom line is the industry as a whole is bleeding. Why it's bleeding? Because as of June, the discoms owe as much as 1.2 lakh crores to GenCos. So that's one part. So if electricity is to be taken as a conduit of lifestyle improvement and economic transformation, then it has to be costed properly, which means the tariff orders are to be timely, appropriate. B, user charges are to be paid. And here there is a huge trust deficit, because as consumers, I feel I'm not getting the service. There is no value for money. I don't see any entrenched value in electricity, which is what we have not been able to carry through. C, as you rightly said, contracts have to be enforced, which means the adjudication process under regulation has so far been found wanting, and hence there is an amendment proposed. Because the arbitration is also not a means we have found to be very effective in the Indian context. And lastly, the projects have to be enabled, new projects, because capacity expansion is necessary to keep pace with growth. Now, distribution reforms will have to serve this economic context of being able to finance the growth of the industry, because in distribution is where the cash lies. That's one. So, unless you are adept in adequately collecting the cash against your sale of electricity, you are nowhere. So we come down to the basic business process of metering, billing, collection, and loss control. So that's all about distribution. There is another economic context which Dr. Mishra touched upon, and it's very pertinent. We have to, and that's a market context, we have to understand that regulatory businesses with guaranteed returns will increasingly come under political headwinds. You just can't sit pretty tight, seeing that I'm going to earn 15-16% return. So your cost of capital will be under stakeholder question all through. If that be so, you have to find a way to reduce the cost of your service. And the point to start with is the cost of power. Because as per the PFC report, it is as much as 78% of your cost. So it is the market, it is the contestability, it is the market, it is the competition which is going to reduce your cost of power. How? By deepening the short-term market, by having a high-resolution short-term power market. How to do it? we have to find a way of PPAs, existing PPAs, legacy PPAs, to be market compliant, to be compliant with wholesale market operation. How do you do it? Yes, there is already a discussion paper. We can go into the details. The basic purpose is that there is also a proposal of recompensing the generators, so that, you know, having set up the capacity and entered into PPA, they are not left in the lurch. So that's one. Two, what does it mean for DISCOM? And that is where, you know, reforms are contextual. It means that you can't just, you know, rest on executing a long-term PPA based on some kind of forecasting which doesn't have a scientific basis, and end up paying your fixed charges by not scheduling power. So you have to have an optimum portfolio construct of power procurement based on meeting your base loads, for which you will have term contracts, forward contracts. The market now allows you, you know, term contract beyond 11 days. So it need not be always 25 years. It can be month ahead, season ahead. It can be a year ahead contract. That's one. You will also have to base quite substantially on market-based procurement, on day-ahead and intraday basis. If necessary, you will have to do contingency planning. Why? Because there is more and more ingress of renewable energy, more and more penetration of distributed energy resources. You have to accommodate that. You have to make a platform of integrating DR with your mainstream functions. That is how the model is going to change. That is where regulation has to come in more effectively. That is where you will have to provide incentives for investing in facilitation of DR platform. So it will be, such investment should be taken as capital asset for rate-based calculation. Or you may have to build up a layer of incentives on existing cost of service regulations by benchmarking performance with improvement in system efficiencies, peak load reduction, as well as system load factor improvement. So these are the areas, you know, where distribution reforms have to now step in. So there is a market context. And if I may extend the argument further, there is also a climate context of enabling more and more DARs into the system, as I said, EV included. So eventually regulation also have to take a different course in terms of encouraging energy efficiency and demand side management by bringing in effectively the time of day tariff, not the way it is today, but you have to bring in the concept of critical peak pricing, as well as time of use pricing, which will make a very clear distinction and generate price sensitive signals for consumers to move beyond voluntary load shifting to a regime of interruptible loads which can be pumped back into the system. So there is an economic context, as I said, there is a market context, there is a climate context. Last but not the least, and that is the missing piece, there is a customer context. See, if you look at UK, you know, the reforms were successful because they were repeatedly revisited in the context of whether customers were getting the benefit of price advantage or service improvement. And that's how, you know, the RPI minus X came in. So there was a rebalancing of costs set off by efficiency gains, one, and then they moved on to the RIIO concept, which is basically revenue being a function of investment, innovation, which is again linked with climate change interventions and your outcome. So it all changed. They kept on changing because they found that there was some kind of market failure in addressing the consumer interests. And again, you know, I was reading the other day, it only came out a couple of days back, during the ongoing COVID in US, you know, the most trusted provider ranked by the business consumers, the industry, has been found to be the utility, ahead of primary banks and vendors with whom they trade. That's because, you know, they were making the interventions of rate changes, which is allowable in their context, may not be in ours, but they were also giving them the different expenditure plan. So it basically shows your alignment with customers, which is what we don't do, which narrative we don't have. And as they very clearly say, that reforms don't succeed, in fact, they fail if they are not understood, believed, and accepted by those whom they affect. So this is the communication we are missing. So in terms of Gaurav's question of financing and tariff, there are two suggestions I have in mind. One is in the context of cross subsidy, the way we deal with it is not right. We can't wish away subsidy. In an economy like ours, where where energy security and access is low, give me some time, I'll just connect my battery, okay? Just time. Yeah, I'm sorry for the interruption. Yeah. So essentially, we are saying that in the context of consumers, this is the trust deficit we have, because the consumers would always feel that what I'm paying for is not there. Coming back to cross subsidy, see, there are alternative pathways. One is what the economic survey has suggested. As I said, we can't dispense with subsidy altogether in an economy in our context like ours. First and foremost is that one may consider intra-category cross-subsidization within the same consumer class. And this is what has been tried in Bangladesh, in our neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, as well as Vietnam, and they have shown a much higher progressivity of tariff within the same consumer category, meaning thereby that those in the higher consumption bracket will be subsidizing those who belong to the low income groups. And it's ditto for industry, commerce, as well as residential consumers. The second alternative is that we can always create an universal charge, which will be a uniform charge payable by every consumer, depending on his consumption. So it's a unitary charge, except those who fall in lifeline and BPL categories. So that is in terms of cross-subsidized consumers. Yeah. Sanjeev, you want to say something? Hello.
I muted myself because my dog was barking, not me.
No, okay. So I thought, no, you wanted to intervene, and if I was overstepping my time. I'll quickly come to the point. The other thing is the retail tariff construct. It's something where we have to be a little diligent about. Why I'll say is because, see, we are always in a regime of average cost of supply. That doesn't work with consumers. And that also does not give the regulator an overview of what cost is incurred in serving consumers. The proposal we have, and we have worked on this with Ministry of Power, is that we must have a system of cost functionalization, which will be according to the costs incurred under generation, transmission, and distribution. Then cost classification. So essentially, it's basically identifying the fixed and variable costs. And finally, the cost allocation according to network and energy usage in each consumer category under the appropriate voltages. Now, once you do that, and once you share it with customers, and there is no harm in doing that, because eventually when you file your tariff, your books are open for public scrutiny. So once a consumer understands that this is the cost, cost to serve, and we also have seen that if you do a pilot study identifying the cost of outage, so once you correlate the cost of service vis-a-vis the cost of outage, what happens is a consumer sees the intrinsic value of electricity, and then, he has the willingness to pay. And once he has a willingness to pay, and that answers Gaurav's question that how do we do a bit of tariff rationalization, the next measure, of course, for the DISCOM to make sure that he also has the ability to pay. So it's basically doing a kind of tariff regime, where the consumer is also part of the operations, has an insight of the utility operations, and then, he becomes your partner in progress. And Gaurav, should I stop here? Because I think, I have been overstepping the time, but there are a few other issues which I will like to address, basically on your idea of what strategy should be followed in terms of PPA adequacy, what investments are to be done, and finally, how the ownership and management control is to be addressed.
So thank you, Mr. Neogi. Yes, we will come back to you in the second round. We are somewhat behind the schedule, and therefore I will request now, our next two speakers, Reji and Shalabh, to try to contain their remarks within 5 minutes. So Reji, please go ahead.
Thank you, Gaurav and Sanjay, and thank Shalabh also for this great idea to have a webinar like that during this lockdown period or semi-lockdown period. ISGF ourselves have not been doing too many webinars over this couple of months. Well, we talked about many bad things and good things and problems. So I like to start with some good notes. So as Sanjeev has said that we have solved the supply problem. So when I started my career in early 80s in the India installed capacity was somewhere around 35, 36,000, more than 300,000 megawatts. Less than 40 years, it has gone to 10 times. So that's a great stride which you have made. Looking at where we started in 47, we had only 1,300 megawatts. So, and we have compared to many other developed countries, we have a transmission grid which is much more modern, smarter, and the entire 3 million square kilometer of the subcontinent is on one grid, and which is fairly stable, and we have all sophisticated control systems on that. And 690,000 villages we have electrified. That too, the second time in 2005, 2006, we reclassified the electrified villages, where one bulb in the village was we could tick mark it as an electrified village. The definition we changed, and then we completed the village electrification, and then still 90% of the households were not connected, but still we classified them as electrified villages. That is also we corrected in a short span of 17 months, 26.3 million households we connected to the grid. So, well, the question is, do they all get electricity every day? Do they get quality electricity 24/7? No, but that is also we will do. We have last 15 years, what we have done is a great journey, and very few parallels in the world what we have done, considering that it's not a small country like Vietnam or Thailand or Sri Lanka or any of them. None of those countries even coming equivalent to even an average size state in India. So we are talking about 1.3 billion people. Our utilities are servicing them, and with 95% of the distribution companies owned by respective state governments, ruled by a different combination of political parties, is not a small challenge which any consultant can write. So I've been seeing a lot of questions in the chat box, so that prompted me to make that comment. So look at that. 99.9% of the households are connected, 690,000 villages we have done. We have issues. And on a bigger scale, on the AT&C losses, which Rajiv talked about, yes. If you go back to 2004, when we had first time looked at what is this AT&C losses, we got a number of something like 36.36% something, or 36.35%. Today, the all India number, we are somewhere at 17.23%, less than 50% of what it was 15 years ago. That's a great achievement, considering that 1,200 billion units of electricity we are consuming every year. At that 15% of that 1,200 billion which we have saved is a great number. We have not invested to that extent in to achieve those. But as again Reji has rightly said, 8 or 10 states account for almost 70-80% of that losses, whose losses are more than 30 to 40%. yes, in those states, even today, the lion's share of the losses are technical losses. I see 11 kV lines running 100 kilometers. Some of the places more than 100 kilometers. We have something like 500 million wire joints. I've been taking this issue in many places. In the past, we had done the distribution line, the LT line joints, 500 million joints. Every second we are losing 5 to 10 watts of electricity on that. And those are all twisted pair wire joints, which are not crimped joints. But the later, last 5 years, whatever rural electrification and other work which you are doing, we have decent joints. So we need to look at correcting the STLT ratio, correcting the phase imbalance, correcting the wire joints, upgrading the system wherever it's overloaded. All these things we need to do in some of the states. It's not all 28 states and 9 union territories we need to do that today. It's only identified few union territories and 7-8 states. That correction we need to do it on fast track. Then coming to the what has happened in the last 5-6 months, it's in a way for utilities on the financial side, they are finding it extremely difficult. But on the other side, the business practices side, they are all going to paperless now. And these are the same people. This is not only applying to the electricity distribution companies, it's applying to entire businesses, including government and banks. The people who insisted on 4 signature and a rubber stamp on it, without that they did nothing. Today, a simple email or a electronic message is sufficient for them. This is a great opportunity for all these people to change their business processes into digitalization. And from last 8-9 years, we have been advocating for digitalization. We have been advocating utilities to have a roadmap for digitalization. Very few utilities came forward and they did it. And those who have done it, whenever their managing director changed with a new Babu, and the old roadmap gone to dustbin. So again, it started from the zero. So there are a couple of major issues which we need to do. Most of my comments are related to not to the private discoms, but to the government discoms. We have to look at having permanent management. You know, typically the managing director or the CMDs, they are there for 2 years or less than 2 years in some states they 2.5 years. And the principal secretary who are their bosses, principal secretary energy, they are also there for 1 year or 2 years. Both of them together for a board meeting, maximum 4 board meeting, nothing get decided during that 4 board meetings of their common tenure. I'm seeing it every day from state after state after state. And the states which made progress, major progress in terms of AT&C loss reduction in operational efficiencies are all states where the same leadership was there, whether he's an engineer from the engineering side or from the bureaucracy, it doesn't matter. Background doesn't matter. Ownership doesn't matter. Management matter. There was a permanency of management. Whichever state you look at it last 10 years, wherever there was a senior leadership team continued there for 4 years, 5 years, that's the places where major performance improvement happened. This digitalization part, I again underscore that they need to have a digitalization or a transformation roadmap, which is the most important thing, and that should be approved by the board, and irrespective of the change of their principal secretary or the chairman of the board or the managing director, that they should follow that board, and regulators should make it them accountable for following such roadmaps. And from the APD, many of these people, again, the numbers which you are talking about, whether it is 36% losses I talked about in 2004, whether that was correct or today's 17% is correct, we don't know. These are all accumulated meter reading numbers across a year. So a customer number is taken in 1 month or 2 months in some utilities. So no time-stamped data we have. It's a monthly or a bi-monthly energy accounting which you have done across different systems in one utility itself. None of these fellows, other than the small private discoms, nobody else have one billing system. Each one of them have 2, 3, 4 billing systems. So you can never do an energy accounting. You can come to a real number where your losses are 14% or 35%, couple of percentage here and there. That is one thing which we have been advocating for a long time, that there has to be one billing system. In 2018, sometime in early June or end of May, Ministry of Power, the distribution department, they held a brainstorming session of all the think tanks for a full day for the suggestions, public consultations on what should be the next round of distribution reforms. And all of them had different ideas, and they were given 10 days for people to put it in writing and give it. We had given some 21 different points. So many of the points, some are still relevant and need to be addressed. Some of them which I already told. And another biggest problem for this government-owned discoms is the procurement process. I often say that we will always be a developed country unless we see a strategy to move away from the L1 bidding. In every bidding, how much you do QC, BC or 80%, 20%, whatever you do, there will be some people who will manage to get a qualifying certificate from a language which you cannot read and an experience certificate from places which no way you can cross-check, and they will get through and they will get qualified and they will put a unworkable price. They will supply equipment which will not function. And as a result, every time we have been going this L1 business. L1 business we have to move. And on the power quality, today, every equipment which you have at home, you have digital equipment which require high quality power. And the quality of power is something which has been completely a neglected subject. We need to work on that. Discoms need to work on that. And training and capacity building is another major area. In RIPDRP, there was 52,000 crore rupees which was allocated for the network improvement, the IT automation systems. There are only 200 crore rupees for training and capacity building, out of which even half of it they couldn't spend in that 6 or 7 years. We have been advocating any new technology, any new systems which you do, at least 5% of the budget should customarily go for training and capacity building of the employees of the discoms or the utility. And those fellows who have been trained should be kept there until their next 2 level of people are trained. Despite promotion or retirement, they should be held there, those who are trained. So there are many things like that. You heard a lot about distributed generation resources proliferating on the distribution grid, as well as electric vehicles. These two are going to increase only, it is not going to come down. Last 3 years consistently, we have added more renewable energy than the traditional power. And our RE cost has come well below 3 rupees. Recently, we had the round the clock, that's a misnomer actually, but RTC bid in end of May, the companies who have won is also at 2 rupee 90 paise. So 2 rupee 90 and 2 rupee 91 paise. So no new capacity addition from coal or gas or any other means is not going to be economically competitive or viable in this scenario. And we have to have more systems in the distribution grid where all these problems are. When the large wind farms and solar farms which are being added, there is green corridor, there are many REMCs, many other things which you have done, but on the distributed generation, which are smaller capacity, rooftop PV and other things which are connected to the low voltage and medium voltage grid, there has been a complete negligence. And 2 years ago, India Smart Grid Forum took up a study on the 40 gigawatt of rooftop solar, which is in the target of 175 gigawatt RE by 2022. We did a study what it takes to integrate that 40 gigawatt of rooftop solar. And as you know, that's an area where we are actually lagging behind. The achievement is less than 10%, whereas in other area we have done exceedingly well. So this RTPV, if we have to really integrate with the medium voltage and low voltage grid, we need about 10 gigawatt hour of energy storage. And when we started the study, we examined all energy storage technologies, but we came to the conclusion that it's batteries which are going to be most optimal, cost competitive, it can be faster deployment, and it can be removed. We looked at 3 places: at the substation level, at the distribution transformer level, at the customer end. 3 places for this battery to be deployed. Each of them can be, as the distribution grid becomes more and more stronger in the rural areas, we can ship them to other applications in other regions of the grid. So we strongly recommended, there was some question of that in the chat box also. We strongly recommended to the regulators and the ministries that look at battery storage, which is going to be cheaper today. 87% price came down in last 10 years, and by 2025 the price will again half. Will go well below $100 per kilowatt hour. So nothing else, no technology will be able to beat any time in the next 10-15 years on battery storage, and the life of this battery is also increasing. So we have talked about performance-based regulation, which is business process re-engineering, and also a right to electricity act. As you know, about 70 to 80,000 megawatt of large DG set is still on the system. People are still buying because of the unreliability of the distribution grid in many places. So many states, those are still there. And every kilowatt hour of electricity from the DG set is still 15, 16 rupees. All those people who are relying on that, be it an industry or a gated community or a commercial building, they are all willing to pay the true cost of electricity. They need not be at the regulated price of 6 rupees or 8 rupees. They will be happy to pay that 10 rupees or 12 rupees. I, as a customer, I don't want an inverter. I don't want a DG set. I am prepared to pay 10 rupees. Please charge me, but give me 24/7. I have a right to have that electricity. So we have been advocating for that right to electricity act. Go back to the village person who has nothing, who has to buy kerosene to light for 2 hours in the evening. For him also, as a percentage of his income, it's a much higher cost for him for his energy need compared to other people who are getting electricity at a regulated price. So we have to rationalize this. And on the franchisee part, we have been advocating that the franchisee should not be only for the smart cities or for the urban areas. It has to be the complete district or a larger area where rural and urban both has been given to same franchisee. We cannot go on socializing the lost as well as privatizing the profit and socializing the losses. That paradigm will not work. We have to give out a larger area for on franchisee mode. And this is a great opportunity for, and the I will stop at one more point. The biggest problem, my electricity, this is common for both private and government people. They don't know their customer, unfortunately. The electricity bill, the meter is in the name of the landlord or the owner of the land. I stay in a house here in Oscars. The land was sold by somebody 25 years ago to a builder who built a house and sold it to each floor. And it is serviced by at least last 18 years, serviced by a private discom. My landlord name is Kabur. The owner name is Dadalani, who owned the land. And the builder is nowhere ever. Every floor, the bill still comes in the name of Dadalani. I get an email. That's a different thing. The same is the case all across the country. 70% of the people who do not own their own apartment or their business, the shop or the businesses, the electricity bill goes to the owner. And here on a new electricity bill, we are talking about direct benefit transfer. The DBT will go to somebody who doesn't even exist. They have died several years ago. And it has been a major struggle in getting this electricity bill. And we have been advocating in this last brainstorming also, we told, link the, all the people today, you have a Aadhaar. At least an Aadhaar number is required for doing anything today. So Aadhaar number linked to the electricity connection number and give it to all of them. So in the gas, in everything else, it is directly to the customer. Electricity is still not to the customer, it is the landowner. This is a major change which we need to do in this digital era. And as far as the digitalization is concerned, yes, that's the way forward. All the distributed resources and the electric vehicle, they are all going to be sitting on the distribution grid. It can be managed properly only through digital technologies, and for which there has to be a digitalization or a transformation roadmap, and all this utilities should look at that seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Reji. I'm sitting on a forum with you after several years. You still haven't, you still haven't got over your passion that you bring to electricity reform. I can see it still raging inside you. From stormy Reji, let us go to ever calm and ever patient Shalabh Srivastava, who has given up a long career in consulting to work now in the social impact industry. So Shalabh, your comments, please.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah, you're very audible.
Thank you. So distribution sector does not only comprise of discoms and consumers. Besides the discom, there is a regulator, State Electricity Regulatory Commission. There is a state government which owns the discoms, and all other stakeholders are dependent on these first three to be invited. For example, if you want to privatize, private sector will become a stakeholder only if the first two invite them through a competitive process to take up a franchisee or a licensing area and so on. Now, in this landscape of not just the discom, but all stakeholders, and I'll talk a bit more about that, I think the regulator has to play a much bigger role than they have traditionally played. Their ability to independently set tariffs and tariff hikes is very important. in a timely fashion. There's a mindset issue around that. So the reverse correlation between loss reduction and tariff is probably not out of choice, but out of compulsion. Wherever the losses are high, regulators had no choice but to increase tariff in order to recover some little bit of more cash for the DISCOM finances. Wherever the regulators could get away with good low tariff trajectory, low loss trajectories, there was a socialist populist pressure to not increase tariff. So my problem is partly with the tariff, but partly with the mindset. The mindset that let's give it cheap, let's keep it low. I don't think that mindset betrays the mindset of a consumer of the 21st century, even in India, at least not in the urban industrial areas. There are consumers who are paying power backup prices at much higher tariffs simply because they want uninterrupted power supply. And you're clubbing all of them with the same brush when you say that, oh, let's keep the tariff low. Similar mindset is betrayed when privatization is taken up. The state government's first intuitive reaction, Pavlovian response, is to minimize the profit that the private partner can make. Now, if you're trying to minimize, reduce, eliminate the profit, why will any private sector player ever come in? The first principle of the market is that every player needs to make a reasonable profit, not guaranteed profit. Reasonable potential profit subject to his own performance to improve and turn around. But the state governments have a mindset, the bureaucrats at the helms of the affairs and the ministerial powers that we have a mindset that let's squeeze the private sector play, especially if it's a fresh privatization. Unlike CESC and Tata Power and BSES, if it's a fresh privatization happening, the rigmarole is around bidding document. How do we make this bidding document? Standard bid document, SBD. And we have heard speakers say that every state has a different problem. Every state has a different loss problem. It has a different meterization problem. It has a different consumer mix, different landscape and terrain. Then how can we have one standard bidding document, which, or the concept, not the document itself, but the concept of a standard bidding process. Reji talked about the fact that we will never become a developed country unless we chuck L1 and QCBS out of our blood and DNA. I completely agree. So my suggestion, counter suggestion to that is, wherever there is a complex procurement like privatization of a DISCOM, it should be Swiss challenge. Let one proponent study the whole DISCOM and present his case, and that becomes the original initial idea. And then everybody else can respond to that, make a apple-to-apple comparison, and the government can bid it out in a competitive manner. And in case there are no reasonably well-qualified serious players to counter it, it goes to the original proponent, period. I don't think this obsession with L1/low tariff/high subsidy is going to get us anywhere in near future. That's my first suggestion. And the second related suggestion is wherever procurement is not as complex as privatization, it's more of a commodity procurement like meters and software and ERP and network and cables and conductors. It should still not be L1 or QCBS, it should be T1. T1 means the government declares a budget. It does not go about discovering price through the market. It declares its own budget. And vis-a-vis that budget, whosoever scores technically the highest gets awarded. The competition is on your technical ability to serve and deliver the DISCOM and not on your ability to squeeze down your prices through whichever way, right or wrong. That's my second suggestion. Another question was asked, what are the sources of funding? How will the DISCOMs under such financial stress anyways do any kind of transformation? The short answer is those who are really under bad shape, financial health, the only way out is privatization. You need to have a PPP model which works, sustains and endures, because the capital infusion cannot come from the government sources beyond a point. Yes, PSUs maybe, but by and large, it's a corporate sector with a private or PSUs which will need to be attracted to invest and take up either licensing or franchising mechanisms. I personally prefer licensing because it also pins the responsibility of power procurement on the management of the DISCOM and therefore on the private sector management control person, rather than separating it out and just giving franchise of the operations. But that still can be debated either ways. The other sector where private sector is very, very important, the other segment where private sector is very, very important is manufacturing. Today, we are importing most of our meters, panels, electric vehicles, batteries, electricity efficient devices like LEDs. If we are all going to import all of this and from countries where we specifically don't want to import, given the recent developments, we need to have private sector manufacturers and private sector domestic manufacturing segment also grow up in tandem with generators and distributors from the corporate side. It's not in isolation that only distribution as a function can be privatized and there is no matching investment and evolution of the domestic manufacturing sector in India. Last question that I want to address, which was raised by Gaurav, is what should be the investment priorities? In my view, the priority number one for all discoms and including especially the government discoms should be employees. They need to train, refresh, rehire, recruit, reinvent, reskill their employees, both on technical side, on customer orientation and service in terms of from basic conduct to operating computers to fetching data from smart meters, from making sense of big data analytics. Unless the employee on the ground, all the way from lineman to the managing director, is completely upskilled and upgraded to the current state of affairs where electricity business has reached globally, nothing else will move. In any other sector, employees have been dealt with a much better deal than we have. In our electricity distribution sector, employee can make much more money by not doing what he's supposed to do off the ground, off the field. And that equation has to be tilted. It has to be reversed in a manner where employees are empowered, both held accountable for, but then also motivated and rewarded for doing their duty in a ethical manner and competent manner. Priority number two is technology. Number one is employees. Number two is technology. Thankfully, training employees doesn't cost much in terms of money. It costs a lot more in terms of mindset. Technology, however, is capital intensive. The reason I say technology is important as the second most vital investment priority is because I'm referring to embedded technologies which make any distribution network smart, intelligent, and automated. That's like the nervous system of a body. So we've been investing in bones and muscles without really developing nervous system and brain of the distribution infrastructure. If we have, so let's present the reverse scenario. If we have a good embedded technologies across smart grid, smart metering, ERP, billing, customer care, energy audit, and so on, what all will it enable which we are currently missing out? Things like you want to do carriage and content separation to enhance competition. You can't do it unless your data is up to date, your network assets are adequately mapped, your consumers are rightly indexed, your input, output, energy are exactly reconciled to the extent possible on near real-time basis. So even to do that, and I can see why it's not there in the amendment to the Electricity Act. Technology-wise, we are not as yet geared up to implement. Now it's a moot point whether the push comes first or the investment comes first, and that can be debated either ways. Second is smart metering and net metering. Unless we have and prepaid billing, all three are related to the fact that we need to have smart grids and smart meters in place. Without this, none of these will push off in the way that they should be. Third is TOD tariff. If you want TOD tariff to penetrate far, wide, and deep across to almost as many consumers as is possible, maybe with the exception of Lifeline or some kind of a subvention thereof, all of that will again need smart metering. Now, today, smart meter is compared with a static meter is compared with an electromechanical meter, and that is compared with the option of having no meters at all. If that's how we look at it, obviously smart meters will appear expensive. The only way they will appear cost effective is that we believe that that's the only option going forward, and they have to be manufactured domestically, and they have to be implemented at scale, like ESL model of procurement or whichever model of procurement which doesn't rely on L1. And finally, things like power quality. So unless we are measuring SAIDI, SAIFI, KAIFI at the nodal grassroots level down to the LT level of network, there is no way that power quality will get measured, quantified, and eventually rewarded. So again, goes back to technology, goes back to tech infrastructure and digital infrastructure to be able to enable a lot of these process reforms. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you, Shalabh, for being very succinct and also touching upon areas which others had not talked about. So very useful. We have had a full comprehensive round with a lot of discussion and rich detail, but we are 45 minutes behind schedule. So first of all, I would like to request if we can extend this discussion maybe for at least 30 minutes. We have a lot of participants and a lot of questions to field. I know Rajib perhaps has to leave, and we have a second round So I will like maybe to start with Rajiv and have a very quick 2 minutes intervention before he leaves for another meeting. And then next, Mr. Padmanabhan, followed by Anjali. I think we'll have a short second round with only 3 panelists and then go to Q&A directly. So Rajiv, before you leave, maybe a quick couple of points.
Thank you, Gaurav. Something which was very interesting, 360-degree we could cover. That means right from the point we started, what are the pain points for distribution, to the regulatory issues, to the issues where whether the distribution companies are really utilizing the market, and how the benefits can be passed down to the consumers. Everything has been covered. But the most important thing which I could not cover during my short presentation was why discoms are not participating or getting the full benefit of the market, which Mr. Neogi tried to touch upon, that the cost of power procurement seems to be something which is the most significant if you would like to have the operational efficiency of the discoms. But the most interesting thing is how much operational efficiency they can garnish at this point of time, when the 90% of their power procurement is tied up on a long-term PPA, and they can get the benefit as soon as we see some numbers from the market coming that during the COVID period, the prices in the short-term market or the exchanges have come down to a level of 2.40 rupees RTM. That is not being reflected in the actual tariff, which goes to the benefit of the customer. And this is something which is very interesting, because the liquidity or the depth of the market today in Indian condition is really very shallow, and we need to deepen it further if the benefit has to go to the discom and particularly to the end consumers at the last. Of course, Shalabh was very right in saying that many of the large scale reforms like carriage and condense separation or major reforms which we have been discussing for so long is not being contemplated right now. But there are many reforms which are being discussed, and let me tell you, the last 4 years, 2016 to 2020, we have seen major reforms in terms of tariff policy, in terms of the new regulations in the power market 2010 on anvil, and many more things which are coming, so that the market can get the discoms can get the benefit of the market. But certainly we have to relook how the power procurement and the portfolios of the discoms are being managed at this point of time. There has to be a scientific way of forecasting, measuring, analyzing, and then procuring best from the market, and then only they can get the best out of the market what we have today. So with these words, I would like to just get permitted for attending. Yeah, please.
Rajiv, if I may just ask you one last question before you leave. What is PTC's intent behind planning to set up a third exchange? So how do discoms benefit from that?
Gaurav, you are very right. Right now, if you see, there is no competition in exchange. Virtually 98-99% of the total exchange day-ahead market and the RTM market is with one exchange. I'll not like to name the exchange, but that is with one exchange. And if you really see in the last 10 years, 2010, the power market regulation came into being, and virtually we are having only 2 products which are operating in the last 10 years. Virtually for 8-9 years, there was only one product which was a day-ahead market which was operating and which could get only 4% of the market. So if there is no competition, there is no innovation, and new products cannot be introduced. PTC would like to, I mean, I'll not say PTC, it's an exchange which is jointly promoted by Bombay Stock Exchange, ICICI, and PTC. And of course, the other market operators. So they would like to bring something which will be innovative, which is friendly for the distribution companies and other consumers, industrial consumers, because it is not one product which is going to serve for everyone, including some of the merchant renewable which we are trying to discuss for last so many years, but we could not bring. So there are many products, including cross-border trade and other issues which we were discussing. Mr. Padmanabhan is leading this for the last so many years. We are discussing, we are participating in the discussions in various forums, USAID forums, but we could not convert into a product. So we strongly believe that there has to be active players in the market who can bring innovative products for the benefit of all.
Thank you, Rajib, so much. I know you have another meeting starting maybe now, so we appreciate your taking time, and I understand you have to leave. Thank you so much, Rajib.
Thank you, other panelists, and I'm really grateful that you could accommodate me in exiting the for attending the other meeting. Thank you, Gaurav.
I'll next, request Mr. Padmanabhan to, make comments, on IRP, expand a little bit what he was talking about, and also I think there have been some thoughts on tariff rationalization, and specifically, on the rural side, how does his concept of energy productivity links with what we heard from other panelists?
Thank you, Gaurav. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. The last time I was very brief because I took it very seriously that you should not take more than 5 minutes. I'll be brief this time too. Thanks for the 2 questions that you asked. IRP is not a ploy to get the state to intervene through the back door and perform the power sector reform work as done in the past. The idea really is to provide the regulatory commissions with the ability and oversightedness required to strategically direct the sector to move in a particular direction. IRP, in fact, even in deregulated utilities abroad, IRP is seen as, Sanjeev, just to address your point that we might probably be getting the state to come back again to the back door to control the sector, that probably is a little misplaced. The purpose and intent of power sector reform, the utility, and to some extent that has been achieved, and that ought to continue. And this is not in any way to strengthen the ability of the state to control the functions of the utility, but definitely to strengthen the ability of regulatory commissions to provide need to be pushed and prodded to move towards energy efficiency and demand side management. And probably one way they could do that is to get the evidence on the table that these measures on deficiency and DSM are more cost effective than for them to buy. Make those kinds of arguments and to put is extremely important, and that's why I had suggested in the first round that we ought to make IRP a mandate so that it is seen as some principle which the utility sector has to follow. The second point, Gaurav, you mentioned about pricing and productivity. Now, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and we heard it from Mr. Neogi and we heard it from several others, is power supply to agriculture. We know it is subsidized, and we know that pricing is convoluted, that the industrial sector ends up paying the most for power, which is the cheapest for them to receive in terms of cost of supply, and agriculture is precisely the reverse. This is very well known. But for a moment, if you look at the industrial sector and the willingness and ability of the industrial sector to pay for the power, one of the reasons why the industrial sector pays much more for the power than it costs the utility to deliver to them is because the industrial sector is a value-added sector. It's a manufacturing sector. It is expected that this sector would recover the cost of energy from the cost of the product which they sell. So that's how that kind of business operates. Now, if you were to use that thinking and that strategy for the agricultural sector for a moment and see whether we can improve the revenue of so that the farmer will be in a position to pay for the power that he gets from the utility. Now, what that really means is that the farmer needs to engage or be engaged in value addition, which is of a higher order than what it is today. What that translates itself into is energy productivity of consumed in farm to produce a product which enables the farmer to make a profit and pay for the electricity, similarly to what industry does. Now, this may appear to be very far-fetched, but this is the direction in which we ought to be moving, where we look at energy productivity rather than looking at energy efficiency through the kind of interventions we are talking about. So the kind of question that we need to ask is not so much how energy is used in farms, but what is it used for? Now, how energy is used in farms is a question that we have been asking all these years, and we know the answer. It is used inefficiently. We know the responses to that. We know the way to reduce AT&C losses in the supply of power to farms. It was all mentioned in the earlier speakers. Yes, the question related to reconductoring, the question related to HT/LT ratios, the question related to improved efficiency of pump sets, and even digitalization of power supply through smart motors and smart pump systems and so on and so forth. These are very well known. They need to be done. They need to kind of reduce the losses. But in spite of all of that, tariffs are subsidized and they are low. So the question is, how do we ensure that the tariffs are connected to the revenue generating ability of the farmer in terms of the produce that he produces through diversification, modernization, and so on and so forth. Now, the KUSUM scheme is a case in point. It's a good example. In the KUSUM scheme, your solarization of pump sets, providing solar power through solar power systems to enable the farmer to sell power to the grid or to sell power to other entities in the neighboring area. In other words, don't look at it so much as solar power, but look at it from the point of view of the ability of the farmer to earn more. When he starts earning more, he's willing to pay for the power. So this is the kind of thinking that we need to now start introducing in order to address this pernicious issue of subsidies. We cannot do away with subsidies, but at the same time, recognize that the subsidy is the single largest element creating the problems to the power sector in terms of fiscal deficit of the state and in terms of the inability of the state to cover the costs related to energy losses. So these were the 2 points I wanted to make, and I thought in the context of the change that we are looking at in the distribution sector, in addition to all the details that we heard earlier, these were the 2 broad strategic details I thought I'd like to put on the table. The one on IRP, which I think need to be mandated, and another is looking at energy productivity as a way to determine the farm tariffs in order to reduce the element of subsidy. That's all I had to say.
So
That's all I had to say at this point, because I think that's what it is. Okay.
Sir, you are on mute. We can't hear you.
Okay, so Mr. Padmanabhan, thank you. He's already left, but let's thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan, for that detailed explanation of that very alarming, suggestion that you gave in the earlier session that we should bring back planning into the Electricity Act. It raised hackles all around from all the reformers, but now we better understand what you actually meant. So thank you for that. Very grateful. Sadly, we're going to be having Shalabh Srivastava also go away for another prefixed appointment. Shalabh, if you have a minute, I wanted to ask you to, if you have a minute, I wanted to just ask you about this wonderful experiment that you are doing in Rajasthan, uh, which is very enigmatically named as Empower Gains. It sounds very attractive, and I, for one, don't know what that initiative is and what it means. And I think there would be many who would be in the same boat as me. So could you take a minute before you go just to enlighten us on what is that initiative and how far has it reached?
Sure. As was pointed out by Rajib Mishra, Rajasthan is probably contributing highest to that loss portfolio of India, probably, or one of the highest. So it's a small initiative that we've started recently. So it's at experimental stages, but the concept is not experimental underlying it. Empower Gains simply stands for employee ownership based gain sharing model. Employee ownership means we take a state owned discom and a small segment within that, maybe a division or a subdivision. We look at the employees who are actually running the show on the ground, who are actually doing what you call metering, billing, collection, customer service, network maintenance, reliability of power, and so on, in whatever conditions they are, as is, where is basis. And within those constraints of their daily life, because that's the reality of 90% of India, right? That we are where we are and we have to make do, at least in the medium term, with the resources that are available. Can we simply turn around one parameter of performance, and that's employee skills, engagement, integrity, to see what they can do? The inspiration for this came from the discom of Kanpur, KESCO in UP, which never went through privatization, but went through a threat of privatization several years ago. And the same employees who handled KESCO traditionally, or a combination of some UPPCL employees deployed in that district, were able to turn that around significantly vis-a-vis rest of the UP. In stark contrast with Purvanchal, Pashchimanchal, etc., a compact geography of one district with a large urban and a very small suburban area surrounding it brought their losses down to this magic figure of 15-16%, which has been touted in RAP, DRP, and UDAY. So what we're trying to do is take that concept in a more systemic and organized manner. Every time you cannot give a threat, you have to engage people, train them, make them accountable, give them a very different performance parameters to operate than their usual time-bound, tenure-bound promotions and transfers and postings. Two, very, very quantifiable parameters which go and sit into your AT&C formula. So we take the AT&C formula, take each parameter out of the numerator and denominator, allocate it to a set of employees, build them into teams, and make them accountable as well as rewardable potentially for improving their respective metric. And then as a team, they improve the AT&C loss and some of the related customer service parameters. And let's see how that goes. We believe that short of a massive overhaul and major structural reforms, this kind of a slow burn process can turn around substantive low-hanging fruits, quick wins in a period of a couple of years. So by the time you've got your bidding document, your privatization procurement, your massive fund infusion from Aditya and Udays and so on, in these formative years, you've got something which is much more ready to be sold or privatized or even to be retained in-house and maybe given off to an employee cooperative 2-3 years down the line. So that's an experiment that we're doing.
So, Shalabh, I asked that because Rahul Patel, who was one of the participants, was actually outraged by hearing you emphasize that privatization is very important for improving performance in distribution. And he asked you that, are you aware that there is a massive ongoing agitation against privatization in distribution subsequent to, the recent announcement by government? So I think this will give some solace to Rahul that you are not a unfeeling, relentless privatizer, ideological privatizer, but where the opportunities exist, they do exist somewhere. Where the opportunities exist, PSUs can be turned around and turned into efficient producers, but it's a tough slog. And,
yeah, it is.
It requires funds and time and so on. Do you want to say something on that? Because you,
Yeah, that point of privatization was largely about funding. How do you bring massive capital funding? That's the where I said the compulsion is to privatize. Thank you. I won't take more time.
right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Anjali, if you are there, you couldn't complete your comments. And specifically, I wanted to ask you, we are talking about privatization here. And how does IFC look at potentially supporting private sector companies in terms of acquiring, some companies which may be ready to be divested? Particularly in urban areas, union territories, which the current government of India plan is. So are you all available, interested? And if yes, what are the indicators which you will look at?
Add another question for Anjali. Anjali, can I add another question which has come from one of the participants? Kinshuk Chaturvedi wants to know, and I think you're the best person to kind of tell him the ground situation. He wants to know that, we are now moving towards net zero, the target of net zero by 2040, I think. And what he wants to know is that what is the competency level of individuals and utilities in the country, both private and public, to address the concerns which arise from walking along this path. So this would be something that IFC would be closely associated with because of the climate agenda. So maybe you could touch on that also. How future ready are we? You there? Gaurav, is Anjali there?
Anjali, I can see you are there. You're on mute, so we can't hear you. No, it seems that, the technical glitch at our end. Anjali?
Gaurav, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. We can see you and we can hear you now. So go ahead, Anjali.
Can you hear me now?
Shall we ask Reji some questions while Anjali fixes herself up?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, Anjali, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm using 3 devices and it's still not working. So Gaurav, very quickly on your second question on IFC's interest, absolutely. As I said earlier also, IFC is definitely interested in the space, and corporatization and privatization is the path that we are expecting distribution companies in India to go forward on, especially with the current discussions which are happening. And if that happens, then we are able to address, the risk and the due diligence which comes with it. This is absolutely a sector that we would want to operate in, and it will be case by case basis. So that's the response to your second question. I want to quickly go and make a point on, there's been a lot of discussion on what happens external to DISCOM, but I think it's also important for the distribution companies to start thinking ahead, to start thinking of the future, and to actually look at themselves as a business. And a case in point there is the whole access discussion which is happening. So with 100% electrification, the impact or the amount that they need to buy or supply is really minimal. It's not anything which has a huge impact. But if you look at the policy, the intent of the policy and the expectation, and some of you may have also read Mr. R.K. Singh's interview in the Indian Express 2 days ago, he's expecting, this to really scale up for these households to buy a lot of products going forward. And if this really happens, and it should happen because that's the right path for the country to go on, what is the impact on distribution companies' finances if they do not do anything right now? Most people who would have visited rural markets would know that maximum number of appliances which are available in these rural areas are low cost, inefficient, and poor quality. which means that they will become guzzlers for electricity, going forward. And, back of the envelope calculations show me that the DISCOM losses could increase anything by, 14,000 to 16,000 crores. And this is all DISCOMs put together, if we buy a few products going forward in the next 3 to 5 years. But if we are able to move these households to efficient appliances, the losses could really decline. And if the additional operational efficiencies, and other reforms come in place, this could actually become a game changer. But I think it's for the DISCOMs to understand this and, track consumption, track consumer behavior, and work with stakeholders who are their partners, in the reform process, to really create massive awareness about efficient appliances and to move their consumers in that direction. So it's not easy. It will take, time to happen. But if you don't start doing it now, you'll end up in a really bad situation going forward, and, more and more financial packages will be needed. So that's one point that I wanted to make. I think to respond to Sanjeev's question on net zero by 2040 and, what is our level of preparedness for this, I think we are on the right path. There is a lot of conversation which is happening on climate, even though, we are dealing with COVID. The kind of discussion that we are having as IFC with some of our clients are very, very focused on climate. There is a need to ramp up climate finance in India. And despite all the issues that we are facing with, slowdown in the economic growth, that discussion hasn't come to a standstill, and which is a good thing. Even though some of the policies that we have seen may not be, pushing us in that direction, but I think it's not that we have stopped talking about it, which to me, brings, it makes me happy that, it's not that this is a closed chapter for us. So I think we're on the path. I think there is a lot that we can achieve, and I'm very optimistic about it.
Gaurav, there's a question here which I thought, I see that Mr. Neogi is back, perhaps.
Yes, he's there.
Yeah, there you are. So Gaurav, can I ask, there's a gentleman here who's a participant, S.E. Angere, who's director of the ICE group. So the question, sir, he has for you is that when will India's policymakers understand that small communally owned microgrids that focus on self-generation and energy storage, reduce transmission and distribution costs while delivering a net zero carbon solution under net zero consumer billing conditions in a full circle net zero waste economy? When will we, is this something that we should be looking at, Mr. Neogi, in distribution?
The answer is yes, because given the vast expanse of the country, decentralized generation and power supply does occupy a space. It's not that it's not happening. It's about finding the economies of scale and how to make the business model that would evolve as being sustainable. Now, is it in terms of rural power supply and building microgrids, you would be knowing that, there are some collaborations that are taking place already, and it has taken roots in states like Bihar, UP, and Orissa. Now, what basically are the challenges? The challenges are, yes, you are remote from the grid, right? But the challenges are basically centered around the economic scalability. Now, if I build a grid, then who are the takers? What basically would be their income level of supporting a price which will sustain the business cost of delivering electricity? Now, what can possibly transpire in future? And basically the models that are being tried out are premised on recovering a fixed charge. So it's nowhere near the economic price of electricity, but when you compare to the grid cost of delivering power, but it at least gives you the reliability. Now, as far as microgrids are concerned, you see, basically, unless the rural economy or the local economy, to be more particular, that improves. So unless you have given them some opportunities of income generation, unless you are able to support micro enterprises, which again will require the broader support of microfinancing institutions. So it is the entire ecosystem of a local economy that needs to be propped up. And one of the issues also is, like, Mr. Padmanabhan mentioned that the Kusum scheme is a harbinger of change. So if it is also, a measure of generating rural income. So unless you are able to do that, provide some kind of foundation on which the income streams can be built, it is very difficult to sustain the business models which go along with microgrids. The fact of the matter is, it is being tried out. We are scaling it up. Policymakers do have an understanding that the microgrids could be the answer in remote areas, especially in difficult terrains, where it is not very economical to take the grid along. So it's been tried out, but the basic challenge remains of supporting the local community with generation of income streams that in turn will support their livelihoods.
Okay.
Mr. Neogi, a follow-on question from another participant, Mr. Jayan Prasad. He asks, what is the hesitation in expanding time of day pricing to say plus minus 50%? I think a more broader point being, shouldn't the peak prices reflect the marginal cost of generation at that point in time? And why can't distribution companies and regulators do that? Because, of course, people who are consuming at that point in time, are generally at the higher end, using air conditioners or other such appliances. And maybe, after you, Mr. Padmanabhan's perspective also on the same point would be very interesting.
See, presently, how is the time of day regime is structured? We have essentially pricing for the regular period, a pricing for the peak period, and the pricing for the non-peak period. The differentiation is not much. Now, in order to have a regimented structure of time of day pricing, you need a few things. One is the basic awareness that what it means in order to have energy efficiency at my backyard. And why it is also not happening, it's a related point, I'll digress a bit. It's because we really haven't seen the DISCOMs or the utility being present behind the meter, which is one way of supporting your business model as and when you migrate to a regime of flat to declining load. So that's one. But the awareness is not there that energy efficiency could be a productive means. And the awareness is also not there on the DISCOM side, as Mr. Padmanabhan keeps saying, that energy efficiency is the first fuel. So that's one. Two, in order to structure, a regimented tariff regime, tariff construct of a time of day pricing. See, you also need a corresponding market, which will basically try to price power according to the hour of usage. Now, we do not have that kind of a sophistication of a market model being developed that power can be priced on an hourly basis, especially, per factor in the critical peak pricing, unless, that there are, takers of such power. So the market, first of all, the market of power delivery has to have a construct, and then only in downstream, you can have a consumer awareness of what hourly pricing would eventually mean in terms of employing the economics of power usage and, the intelligent way of calibrating your power consumption. The other, I won't say bottleneck, but the other hurdle, we have to cross is, as Mr. Pillai was saying, that, there is also the necessity of bringing in the concept of the Internet of Things. So which will lead to more sophistication in your personal energy management. It will generate sales of options. And then as a consumer, being aware, you will take the advantage of dynamic pricing. So, again, it's, if I may come back, it's an ecosystem of building consumer awareness, having a supportive power market, which will have hourly pricing as one of the key components, and then an enabling measure of IoT, which will enable the intelligent usage of equipment.
One of the points that has always puzzled me for very many years is the fact that we have not been able to introduce TOD pricing. And we have also not been able to introduce interruptible tariffs. And there are very good reasons for some of it, as Neogi very rightly explained. But having said that, I think it is time now that we looked at the ability for our utilities to exercise these functions in order to manage these loads, followed routinely by utilities abroad. As I mentioned earlier, load research, I think, is extremely important. We have a lot of data now being accumulated in our utilities because many of our grids are being monitored and there are meters all over the place. But unfortunately, the data is not being put to good use other than for just billing and so on, and maybe some kind of a rudimentary audit, energy balance. But we need to go much beyond that. We need to use this data to develop the rationale for TOD pricing, develop the rationale for peak load management, develop the rationale for load shifting and so on. We have not done so. And I guess the points that Mr. Neogi mentioned, that the market may not be ready, the people are not aware, at least consumers are not aware, are definitely constraints, but they ought not to come in the way of us at least planning at a pilot scale, a large scale TOD tariff determination, as well as its application for certain sectors. As you rightly said, the industrial sector, which pays for, pays the cost of supply and more than the cost of supply, and who also contribute to some extent to the peak load, could also be entities which we could target. We could also target customers in the high end who use air conditioners and so on and so forth, and will be an ability to pay the higher tariffs as required for a TOD. And maybe it's 25% greater, 50% greater than the average tariff, and that has to be seen. But I think it is time that we don't kind of fall back on any kind of excuses and go in for a TOD tariff in one or the other DISCOM, test it out, validate it, prove it, and then others can replicate it.
Thank you, Mr. Padmanabhan. There are two interrelated questions. Reji, I'm coming to you.
On this point, I like to add, TOD is
sure. Please allow me a moment to pose two questions, and you can also answer for that. So there are two very interesting questions from our participants. One, Omar Zada, and second, Rakesh Kandra, asking what is the impact of solar PV on distribution, and the second one asking what is the impact of electric vehicle charging infrastructure on distribution system. I wanted to pose both of these questions to you, Reji, and also please feel free to add.
So I'll start with thank you very much. I'll start with the TOD part. TOD for high volume customers being given in many states which were not because of inadequacy in metering infrastructure. It never worked. Maharashtra started with 6 time frame sometime in 2002 or 2004. Nowhere it could be done. But today, TOD was a good concept when we had majority of the generation coming from dispatchable big plants. But with increasing share of renewables on the grid, which are not exactly dispatchable, we need to move to a real-time pricing or a TOU, time of use pricing. Customer behavior is also changing. You can't exactly predict when the maximum peak load is going to be. The last 4 or 5 years in Delhi, the peak is happening in past midnight. So we have to come to a framework where we'll be able to give 1 hour, half an hour price signals to at least a section of the consumers who have loads which can be shifted. So it's a TOU, and ISGF is doing a pioneering work in Gujarat. We have taken Gujarat as a state where we can do a TOU framework, and that work is almost in the final stages. And our the model will be report, and the model will be submitted by end of September to the regulator and to the state government. That will be a very interesting, which can be replicated in other states. Why we have taken Gujarat is because of the many reasons. I won't get into it then. Coming to the impact of solar on the distributed solar on the medium voltage and low voltage grid is, it's going to be, see today again, any region we take, the percentage of rooftop solar is 2%, 5%, 7% in capacity. Only in California it exceeded 20% or now more than 30%. If you look at the solar load curve, you see it going up and coming down. But if you take every minute, you can see spikes. So to smoothen solar output, you need to have storage or other means on the grid. So we need, as the share of rooftop goes high, we need to have that. We have been advocating that one best way is to integrate vehicles, electric vehicles, which are going to be connected on the same low voltage distribution grid, where the rooftop also will be connected. The vehicle battery giving the smoothening power to smoothening services to the rooftop output of the solar panels. So this is something which we need to do it. Unfortunately, no electric vehicle manufacturers so far been offering vehicle to grid service because their warranty is manufacturer is given warranty for a battery. The battery manufacturer given warranty for a particular life cycle. But if you recollect 3 months ago, Tesla said that 1.6 million kilometer or 1 million mile they are going to give you warranty for the battery. That will outlive the car actually. So in the coming days, battery, both its performance, life, everything is going to be much higher, and all the batteries can be of vehicle to grid services. So integration of rooftop with electric vehicles is very much essential, and that's the way we have been advocating and working on the electric vehicle charging infrastructure standards which BIS is drawing. And another part, if you look at it, the impact of electric vehicles on the grid is going to be very, very major when large number of vehicles are charging at the same time. Whenever the batteries need DC current to charge the battery in the vehicle, either you convert that inside the vehicle on a onboard AC-DC converter or through the charger, the DC fast charger which are connected to the grid. Either way, when AC is converted into DC, harmonics get injected back to the grid. And grid equipment, if not properly sized or have harmonic filters installed, power quality meters installed and power quality monitored in real time, there will be major impacts. There are some incidents already happened in some parts of the country. In India itself, we have studied, we have given recommendations, and we will be publishing. We are currently doing Bangalore city has the maximum number of EV chargers as we speak, and BESCOM want to add another 150 charging stations in addition to the 112 charger which they have already. And they requested ISGF to do a detailed modeling study. We have been doing load flow studies on and impact assessment on the grid on 24 feeders. We already completed 7 or 8 feeders. So that again, we have seen some very interesting results coming out, and some other studies done in Delhi and other parts also. This is an area which utilities need to have proper planning before large rollout of EV charging stations. Thank you.
Sir, you want to pose a few more questions before we close? Maybe last couple of questions.
All right, so let's continue with Reji, because he...
Oh, everybody else left. It's only me and Padmanabhan sir.
No, there's Anjali also there.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Neogi is also there.
Mr. Neogi is also there.
Okay. So sorry, I read your my connection got disconnected.
I'm posing you a bread and butter question which you have evaded thus far. So we need a short and crisp answer from you on this. My question to you, sir, is the following: that you know, in the telecom sector, they say data is the new oil, right? Now, when will data become the new oil and become a source of revenue in the electricity sector? Because it's an obvious source of revenue that we are losing out on. You mentioned that, you know, our metering systems are so short. that the data will be clouded. Whatever data we gathered will be clouded by our not knowing the profile of, the people, the person to whom the data is attributed. Well, that may be in some cases, but surely that cannot be true for all the 240 million households of India. So when will
Well,
data become the new oil for electricity?
I would say very soon, and COVID would push that even faster. Uh, Number one, all the feeders have been metered successfully, and that metering data is available, although not in real time. 15-minute interval data of the all feeders all across the country are available, which has not been put to good use. We have been advocating with the Ministry of Power and PFC that we should aggregate that, and there can be analytical tools to do the load research. Exactly what Mr. Padmanabhan was saying, that is not being taken up at all. That's a high priority. But currently, there's a program which you would have heard in the budget speech of the finance minister also, that 250 million smart meters will be introduced in the country. So that everything is ready, including the standard bidding documents, and we hope that this will be announced by government very soon. And that program will take 3 to 5 years, maybe 7 years to complete. But at least half of India will have smart meters in next 3 to 4 years. As we speak, the real billing is happening only to less than 1% of the customers who have smart meters, which is only in the pilot projects and some other rollout which has happened in Delhi and a couple of other cities. Other than that, 99% of the electricity customers in India after March is being given bill based on estimated consumption. You would have seen a lot of protests by different people, including celebrities, of inflated bill. Well, that is not exactly correct, but we are unable to give a good bill to them, a data to them that we have done meter reading. People spending more hours at home today, 24 hours at home with their air conditioner around, all kind of appliances. Earlier they were 10 hours out of the house, so their consumption has gone up, but we are unable to give them a transparent bill and capture that consumption. So this is going to be, when we have 15-minute interval data of every customer available, that will be the new oil or the new revenue source for that. But there are so many other things, how the digital assets of the utilities can be leveraged for new revenue opportunities. We had done, I mean, that itself is a hour-long discussion, but at least the customer information, we talked to the city gas distribution people. We have given more than 200 cities the gas distribution license. The new gas distribution license, people going to a new town, they don't know who are the customer, where do they live, address, nothing. But as an electricity company, I have everything. I have every address, their data, everything available. So we have been trying to do a marriage of this city gas distribution licensees who are new with the discoms for sharing their customer data, and later the GIS map. Most of the cities, we have 1,400 towns, we have the digital map of the customers and the electricity assets. These are going to be valuable data for anyone who is going to do new business in a city. And there are so many other things. Same for the water distribution people, can be a combined bill. We have been advocating with all these people for a common bill. Electricity bill, water bill, gas bill, all this can be one in one platform, one place. So with after several years of trying, in Delhi there is an experiment with the IS in Tata Power Delhi distribution and Indraprastha gas distribution. One colony, they have two colonies, in fact, in one block they have taken up for a combined billing exercise. So there are the digital assets of all these people are appreciating, whereas your physical assets are depreciating. This is something which utilities are currently realizing it. Only those who have digital assets are the one who are actually today having business continuity. We are able to, many of these platforms were there for last 10 years. None of us used it. After COVID, the lockdown scenario, we are leveraging this or rediscovered and leveraging this for effective. Nobody wants to go back. Today, our productivity working from home is much higher.
Yeah, Reji,
sorry,
I need a concrete, onto this, I need a short, concrete answer. That, distribution billing is around 7 trillion and their losses are in the region of 40-50,000 crores, right? So that's around, what, how much is it, 5% or 6% or 7% of their billing, right? Can data, the new oil, cover up this loss and give some profit, or will it never, can never be valued equivalent to the loss that they're suffering today.
Absolutely, there is no rocket science. This can be done. They should do digitalization with a roadmap, as I said. But today, typical utility has 4 or 5 billing systems, and metering system is in very poor situation, particularly in the rural areas. So many people talk about the theft and electricity theft and things like that. It's happening in less than 2% of the country. As a country, we are not thieves. 99% of the people are honest, and they are committed to pay the actual cost of electricity. Yeah, the difficult pockets are very few, which can be addressed separately. So the utilities need to improve their processes and have commitment to make this transformation, and that is possible. If they do, it is 2 to 3 years time, the data will start becoming oil for them.
Okay.
One last question which I want to pose, and this has come from Mr. S Ahluwalia, who is a former founder chairman, in fact, of the Haryana Electricity Regulatory Commission. And I will pose this question to Mr. Neogi. What he is asking fundamentally is, there have been a lot of recommendations which have come in the past, especially from regulators, writing a series of directives to distribution companies in their tariff orders, sometimes elsewhere. But the change has not happened. And what he makes a point that the distribution companies are state-owned, they are monopoly, and unless this changes, and that's where I think the intention of the government to privatize the union territories now. So your comments on this, but also related point from my side is to what extent you representing private sector, is there an appetite in the current circumstances to acquire the distribution companies? Is private sector, CESC, Tata, Adani's, and so on, will you all invest, if the government is to run a process?
Gaurav, just to interrupt, Ahluwalia sir has posted a message that he wants to talk for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Anyway, we are running 45 minutes late, so please give him 3-4 minutes to talk. Ahluwalia sir.
Sure. But I don't know whether we can, unmute him. I don't know whether technology allows that. I think
Nidhi, that is possible. Can you unmute and let Mr. Ahluwalia speak for 2 minutes?
Nidhi, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear
Yes,
me now?
we can hear you.
So I'm saying I can't find him in the attendees. If I do,
then
I can.
he has left.
Okay. Otherwise, I could have tried to unmute him.
But Mr. Neogi sir, you can come in.
Gaurav,
Yes, let me try and respond to Mr. Ahluwalia. He has seen it all because he was also the regulator when Haryana almost 2 decades back was contemplating privatization of DHBVN, BVN and UHBVN under World Bank tutelage, and it didn't happen. So if it didn't happen, it is also because the point I mentioned right in the beginning that unless there is political consensus and legislative support, it is extremely difficult to pull off privatization because it's an ideological conflict, and it is also the case that there is a trust deficit in terms of considering private capital as being stigmatized. But rather than staying abstract, why, in spite of changes, regulatory frameworks being realigned, why eventually the transformation has not taken place? It's because the change agenda isn't there. And the point has been very well brought out by Mr. Shalabh Srivastava that, we need to invest in people. But essentially, see, what we lack is the alignment. The first of all, building linkages of people, process, and performance, and building scorecards to at least show where we are and where we can be. That's one. But more importantly, the alignment of what the organization sets itself as the overarching goals, the objectives, which we can say as the KPIs, the key performance indicators. Those are not drilled down to the operational level. And then, we do not have the congruence of individual performances aligning with the organizational target. So unless we have that, there is no such vision that people down the line or those in the front line can have. So what's the organizational way of moving forward? We are talking of, making the organization future ready, future shock proof, moving towards a net zero future. But would that percolate down the organization? So unless we see these goals at the granular level, in terms of managing the network, in terms of undertaking the metering, billing, collection services, in terms of improving the loss control, and then scale it up the organization and move it up to the organizational targets. Unless this awareness is there, unless the alignment is there, the core efficiencies of the distribution companies are not going to improve. See, what we are seeing in terms of balance sheet, what Sanjeev said right in the beginning, and we are seeing this, almost 3 bailout packages, and 15 years later, our losses are somewhere around 5 lakh crores, and our accumulated debt is also around 5 lakh crores. And in fact, the net worth is about minus 1.8 lakh crores. So that is where we are. So essentially, see, no matter what changes we have been contemplating, what regulation we have been bringing in fact, it's not that, we are not setting cost reflective tariff. That is the ultimate motto. But then again, what is there in the form of regulation is far removed from the reality, because as Reji said, we are far from far from being data secure and making, our information not asymmetric. So, this is where, we are falling short. So unless we have data security, data integrity, foolproof, data which can support, somebody down the line had also mentioned that, we are talking of 17%, I think Reji himself, we do not really know, whether 17% is correct or 35% is correct. So the major issue where we are getting stuck is that the basic core issue of improving our efficiencies and having at least fundamental aspect of metering, 100% metering, which was part of Electricity Act legislation. If that is not ensured, no matter of sophistication, smart metering, up the line is not going to give us results. So essentially, what I'm saying, trying to put forth is the transformative agenda of turning around the organization is abjectly missing. And we do not have the alignment of frontliners with the top management functioning in order to achieve the organizational goals. Number two, to get back to Gaurav, yes, there is fair amount of interest of private sector participating in the distribution reform process. But as Mr. Srivastava also said, that if there are 27 states, then there may be 300 cases of dealing with them separately, just because the dynamics are different from case to case. So in some places, as you rightly pointed out, that the AT&C loss may be high, and in some cases it may be low, but the efficiencies paradoxically are very much on the negative side. Now, for the private sector to participate, obviously, the bid documents will have to be not conforming to one size fits all. But the basic tenets would be there has to be a regulatory buy-in of binding performance obligations. So in order to give them a fillip, to the selection process. In fact, Mr. Srivastava talked of T1, almost on the same lines. The selection process should give due credence to the business plan which one is presenting. Again, what he's saying about that this is the state as is, and I can take this to be situation. And what is the kind of process flow I am anticipating, and this is how I am trying to bring the improvements forward and align my investments accordingly. 3, you see, basically, you have to restructure the utility operations. So you have to start with a clean balance sheet with only serviceable liabilities. And this is where we went wrong in a few instances. And I'm talking of ownership transfer, not merely franchising. 4, in most cases, you have to bring in the concept of transitional financing so that at least during the initial period, if there are cash losses, that those can be addressed. And how you do that, you see, again, you make it transparent. If it is a transitional financing, let there be bidding on it, in the sense that, whoever seeks the lowest finance is the preferred bidder, and you combine the bidding with efficiency sharing. So it's initial period of transitional financing combined with efficiency gain sharing in the subsequent period, which can be also asymmetric. It can be sort of, I share 20% of the gain at the end of the transition period with consumer, and I scale it up to as much as 50 or 50%, let's say, over a period of time. So you can do a hybrid combination of transition financing with efficiency gain sharing in order to structure the bid. And last but not the least, I think this is also a point that had come around in the discussion, that a private sector participation should always have the flexibility of procuring its own power and not necessarily settle with legacy PPAs, which do not always lead to efficient costs.
Thank you. Thank you, Neogi. Mr. Padmanabhan, I saw you raising your finger once or twice.
Just a quick point on data.
Yeah, please.
I think you had this question, and I thought Mr. Regi answered it very well. But, when you began your presentation, Sanjeev, in the beginning, you mentioned about what we had done on the generation side and done rather well. Also, when we look at generation, you will recall that in the 70s and mid 80s until the early 90s, our plant load factors are very, very low, 45%, 40%, and so on and so forth in many of our thermal power plants. Today, it's increased to 75, maybe even greater. Some of it is due to technology, but a lot of it is also due to data, which has been shared across utilities in terms of O&M. So I think there is success in terms of what we have done on the generation side to improve the plant load factor, the capacity factors of our power plants through good adroit data management and sharing of the data and best practices and so on. I wonder why we can't do it on the distribution side, and get the same level of successes which we had on the generation side. Apart from technology, which definitely did play a role, but there were also a lot on good data management in terms of heat rate improvements and getting those know-hows transferred to other utilities in terms of how to handle high ash Indian coals and so on. There's a wealth of information which CEA had actually promoted and actually disseminated. So I think there's some lessons to be learned within the power sector. That's the limited point I wanted to make.
Yeah, just to tell you that, in fact, one of the participants, I can find his name, he had actually suggested that we should have a national regulatory agency for the distribution sector also, because it is national level regulation which allowed generation to grow and to become productive, and that experience is not replicated in all the states. So there's a problem, but we'll, I think, have to change the Constitution of India for that. So that'll take another complete seminar on its own. Gaurav is telling me that sadly the time is up. So first and foremost, we would like to apologize, to all the many participants who joined us and who very kindly sent in their questions. Sadly, we have not been able to take up all the questions, but let me please assure you that both the institutions, India Smart Grid Forum and RTI, will ensure that these questions that you sent will be circulated to all the panelists. And personally, I have them already because Renu, I think, very kindly, or Nidhi, kindly sent them to me. But it would be really learning for all the panelists to have the questions, because, you know, this is the voice of the people who are hearing you. And some of the issues we have not dealt with because of shortage of time. But in conclusion, let me just say that this has been personally for me, and I'm sure for all of us, a hugely rewarding exchange of views, and a very informed, high-level exchange of views, because the 6 panelists that we had were of such outstanding quality. And I think the broad conclusion we come to, that there is a sense of optimism, that we are on the cusp of change, and that you know, there is a silver lining at the end of whichever road we are going down. But particularly in the context of distribution, as Mr. Neogi and as Shalabh also pointed out, that, you know, I think the change has to start from the ground upwards. And you have to start with the customer, recognize the customer, which would include all the points that Reji has made about how do we get to know the customer if we don't know who it actually is, you know, because of the way the billing is done. So recognize your customer, understand your customer, be in touch with your customer, understand the needs of your customer, and then cater to those needs. C.K. Prahlad, who was the late C.K. Prahlad, who was a business thinker in the US, he actually said that, you know, there's an entire fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. And companies like Unilever have made millions out of, you know, marketing small sachets to those who couldn't afford an entire big bottle of shampoo. So I think, you know, these marketing interventions and marketing innovations, financial innovations, digital innovations, these are the things that should form the bulk of the revenue of distribution. No distribution company has reached that far. And I think that is where we need to go to look for profits, and not simply try and always get it through what are euphemistically called user charges. Because please remember that by parting his or her data to you as the distribution company, I am already paying. In a way, that's like a quasi-user charge, that I'm allowing you to use my data. And though I know there's been a big debate on privacy and judgment is there, but for most Indians, you know, we like our privacy, but there are ways to aggregate data so that you don't encroach on anybody's privacy, but still keep it business friendly and usable. So I think that entire segment, which relates to what Reji was telling us in detail about, the entire aspect of energy efficiency, which has not yet been, you know, completely utilized, that potential has not been used by us. The aspect of, you know, full resource, all system planning, as it were, you know, integrated resource and IRP, what integrated resource, you know, I don't like the word planning. So मैं रुक ही जाता हूँ as soon as I have to say planning. So integrated resource management, you know, which some of which Shalabh talk about, which of course Mr. Padmanabhan is in strong on, and also what, you know, basically Anjali said. Anjali introduced high notes of optimism, and we are thankful to her for that. And so there are a lot of commonalities, you know, in terms of what the participants focused on. We'll stay engaged. Maybe Gaurav will come back to you with another one of these delightful sessions, and we'll carry the conversation forward. I hand it over to Renu to conclude the session. Who else but you can have the last
word? Me now to deliver the vote of thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to deliver the vote of thanks to such an esteemed panelists and our esteemed moderators. So I'll start with, once again, a big thank you to our panelists and moderators for an insightful and thought-provoking discussion. It was indeed very interesting panel, and I've already seen many participants sharing their views about the webinar, being very informative and insightful. Our enlightened speakers have covered all the issues pertaining to the past, present, and future of the electricity distribution system in India to the extent possible. And in the limited time, though we exceeded originally the scheduled time, and I would also like to thank all our participants for their active participation. There were more than 100 questions we received from the audience, and we had over 1,000 registrations from 370 locations for this webinar. So thank you so much for your enthusiastic response to this webinar. And owing to the paucity of time, all the questions could not be taken up, but we will try and send the replies on mail to you in the next few days. And we will also be mailing the recording of this webinar to all our participants, as we have seen a lot of participants requesting for it. So with those words, I, Reena Suri, would like to thank you all once again for being part of this webinar, and hope to have your participation, continued participation in our future events. Please stay safe and take good care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.